So we have decisions about this because we have, so we have our roles. But we have, and we have decisions about this because now we're at 9:47, so timekeeper.
So we're looking at round one, right?
We're looking at round
Number
one.
one. Okay.
And I forget where's the time on this? We need to like,
it's
adjusted times here.
1 hour.
They're 15-minute chunks.
15-minute chunks if we
I'm
wanted
going to
to.
start a 10-minute timer to give us a 5-minute.
And I guess we start on focus area 1 here. Brainstorming possible attributes of the focus area concepts.
Can I just ask if Rosemary can hear us?
Is she part of us?
I'm not sure who that is. Just want to make sure we include everybody in this meeting. Okay,
It might just be.
we're good to go.
Good. Okay. So it looks like there's four things here. Brainstorm possible attributes of focus areas. We can start with that, I guess.
Okay, so I'm just going to bullet point everything we talk about. Okay.
Here's the focus area concepts. Valid, authentic to the work of teaching, formative, reasonable, appropriate for beginning teachers and others.
I had added actually in today's general meeting, which I want to add now,
Yeah.
evidence-based.
Evidence-based.
I would hope that we could brainstorm together if there's any other things that caught our attention before we just work this list.
Sure.
So that's one that caught my attention.
What caught my attention is appropriate for beginning teachers. I don't know what level of appropriate and how we can determine that.
But it is listed as a topic, so
Yeah.
it's D already on the
Oh,
list, right?
right,
I'm
right,
thinking
right.
more
Oh, okay.
about things that are not
Yes.
being
So,
directed
sorry.
towards us directly.
Got it.
So we don't. I'm not writing anything about that. Okay.
Not
Does
yet.
anybody have any other, like I guess F would be evidence-based.
Okay. When it says
G.
brainstorm possible attributes, what is it? I'm sorry, I'm struggling with the
Yeah.
question or the.
So like, like we're gonna have a conversation about A through F now on this list around like.
Is it A through F? Is it A through E?
The A through F is he
We
decided
added-
evidence-based.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that's being added. Thank you.
Yeah.
Apologize.
Well, yeah,
We're
or E.
technically
Technically it's E.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So
So-
are there any other
yeah.
things to add before we start working the list?
Oh, wait, I have some things. Can you just
Yeah.
repeat back, say that, what we have,
So we're looking at A through E and we add in an F.
but what were the words?
Valid,
specific?
formative, reasonable, appropriate to
For
an
beginning
evidence base. I think that yesterday there was,
I have more to add.
yeah, what,
Work of teaching in classroom settings and beginning.
beginning, yeah, yesterday was a conversation about what is it mean for
Because-
beginning teachers, right?
Yeah, because to
Wait.
me, oh, sorry,
Wait, when you
Work
say
of teaching. classroom settings
or classroom settings.
and beginning.
Okay,
And
Wait, I'm sorry. Real quick. I'm sorry. I'm taking notes. So, when you say beginning, doesn't that fall under letter D? Appropriate for beginning teachers?
right, but appropriate and beginning are two different constructs. Like I see it as like when I was looking at it, I'd see like categorically two different things. There's like the methodological things, and then there are like just the constructs of like what is being measured too. So like we've got like valid and authentic, formative, and then we've got like classroom setting, work of teaching, beginning teachers, right? So there's like the measurements themselves and then what is being measured, right? And sometimes they're bundled together in the same letter, but they're two different things.
Okay. So, what are the two
You know
different
what I'm
things? I'm sorry. I'm writing this.
I
as a
do
note.
understand, but I think we could unpack those within the categories that we
Yes.
have.
Yes.
Whereas right now, I think we're requesting, is there anything that's not on the list that's been given to
Yeah,
us?
yes, okay.
Before we dive
Yeah,
deep
I
into
see.
the
Okay.
meanings
Yeah.
of a particular.
So for D, we should define beginning.
Yes.
Yes, that's what I
Right.
mean.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
So as
Yeah.
far as attributes, so we have letters A, B, C, D.
Yes.
Letter E being evidence-based.
Yes.
And then do we need letter F, work of teaching?
no.
No,
because
because
we're
it's
not
inside.
today.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I get
thank
what you're
you.
saying.
I get
what you're
you.
saying.
Letter
Okay.
E is in evidence.
Yeah,
based.
okay, gotcha.
Okay.
Okay.
So do you want to go back to attributes now? I can take
Yes.
an offering to that.
Thank
I
you.
think we all can actually, right? I think we just start to talk.
Yeah.
I think we were invited to, I mean, I can start listing attributes like crazy, right? Around formative, but I think maybe we should just talk about each one and just brainstorm, share.
Sounds like a great idea.
Teacher
So like what
activities.
constitutes
Just what do we
valid and
do?
authentic?
What does it
to the
mean
work
for
of
us?
teaching?
What does it mean? What does it mean for us?
Well, I think the authentic work of teaching has to alludes to what someone mentioned yesterday about the dispositions, the patience, the classroom management, the skill of teaching. But how do you assess that? Right? I don't know how to define authentic for all classroom settings. Because if it's an authentic measurement, how is it communicated via test?
True. There kind of needs to be the word contextual there.
Yes,
Right.
How are we determining authentic if it's just a
Yeah.
test? Or yeah,
If it is just a test, yeah, like you're saying, it can't span the wide range of classroom settings because those are all contextual. And I would also say like cultural, right? Even within San Francisco Unified, there's like many different cultures across the city. And
right. So being authentic to your classroom setting might be different contexts for different
Mhm.
communities.
Whenever I put the word valid up on the board for my teacher candidates at my college, we do brainstorming on valid, and one thing that always pops up is meaningful. So I think that's another way. There's a technical way to define validity, but I'm going to represent my students where it's just meaningful, which maybe is authentic too.
But then it gives us a depth, and like it gives us, it has meaning, right? And authentic is more abstract than defining this is meaning.
Well, and if you unpack meaningful for the work of teaching, you might say, I'm learning, I think it's standard 5, I can't remember my standard numbers, but assessing for learning, basically that standard, and that's represented in the RDI-TPA cycle too. So the idea is you would assess students, what's meaningful to assess for my students in my context, in my classroom, in this unit, in this thing I'm doing with them. So I think of meaningfulness as being contextual.
I was also thinking applicable
Mm-hmm.
on the same line of meaningful, because how many times have we, heard or even experienced ourselves, like, how does this apply to us? Like, like, what am I supposed to do with this? You know what I mean? So meaningful, applicable.
Authentic is actual too, like actual, real, like actual, like valid and authentic to the work of teaching. It's like,
And I do think with the work of teaching, we have to take the guidance for better or worse from the actual standards themselves, because in a way, the state has helped us to define what it considers to be
exactly.
Work of teaching, informed by research, we hope. Some of it is, of course, but it is what a framework, right?
And the other thing I was thinking about when we're talking about context and culture is that, and like the whole the idea of local assessment is that we're people that move. Like, what is, like, to say that a teacher is teaching in Los Angeles is not going to, they're not going to always teach in Los Angeles. They can move and teach in Bakersfield. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, you know what I mean?
I'm gonna just jump down a little bit to D, because I think this kind of encapsulates what we're saying. But instead of determining these things for beginning teachers, I think we should eliminate beginning teachers and make it credential candidates, because beginning teachers is year 1 teacher, and a credential candidate is working towards their credential. And I feel like beginning teacher expectations are way different than earning your credential. Right. And so I think maybe the language then just shifts, and it kind of shifts our mindset. This is a credential candidate. They're not the classroom, the teacher on record yet.
Right.
And so preparing them to get to beginning teacher level, which would be
In other words,
different.
we're not induction
Right,
providers.
right. Beginning
We're
teachers are induction students
ready for induction.
ready for induction, right? And I think if we shift our language to appropriate for credential candidates, then it'll give us a better scope of where we're going instead of more.
So can we jump back up to A again? I know you jumped us.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I'm thinking that it's kind of an overarching theme
Authentic.
of how are we authentically determining assessments for credential candidates,
point.
not beginning teachers.
In other words,
So
these are
that's
actually connected. They're not quite so
Yes.
separate. as
exactly.
they
Yeah,
were
that's
presented.
that's what I'm getting at. So I think
Did we
Right.
include practical? already.
We
think
didn't,
so.
but
We
that's,
didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
Meaningful,
one.
equitable, practical.
And
It's an
because
attribute that describes all of the drama that they face or challenges. Some of the, when I take the TPA, I'm like, okay, this is great. In my day to day, I can't do exactly as what
Right.
you're asking me to do,
right,
especially like in my context, if I'm dealing with district mandates or protocols at the school site. I'm trying to find a way to encapsulate that idea where it's making it like valid and authentic to the various contexts.
and,
I'm struggling to
Right.
wrap that up in
and
one or two
even,
words.
I'm thinking also, as a credential candidate, as we're creating these things, we also have to consider they're credential candidates, so they're also taking coursework, they're also spending their days in classrooms, and so if we're assessing what they're doing throughout the day, we have to be mindful in the amount of work that's getting put into it, because the TPA is taking a whole lot of classroom coursework, instructional time, because they're spending so much time teaching to the test.
Credential,
Also.
I just want to check my knowledge, credential candidates, because in the context that I'm in their residency, so they spend a whole year inside of classrooms with mentor teachers. Is that the same for?
Student
that's a
teaching and-
difference. That's a critical
It's a
difference in
difference. Okay. So
preparation.
they're not
And
in their own classrooms. They
Right.
don't have control
They don't
over the
have
classroom
any-
environment the same way.
Right,
Okay,
yeah.
Mhm.
I
So
just want
the-
to check my
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah,
about
I
that.
think the context variables are always going to be on our minds,
Yeah.
and we are so
Yeah.
close to
Yeah.
context. But can I also just go back to just the premise of valid and authentic to the work of teaching? I just was noticing again, because Tina Sloan and others have noted that, there are words about validity that are built into this TPA. In fact, there's justifications that have been done by our colleagues at Pearson and other places who said we've developed an instrument that is valid. I want to point out that everyone would agree valid for a particular use.
Right.
So one of the things I think, kind of back to practicality, is valid and authentic, not just to the work of teaching, but to the uses of the work of teaching, which could be different for different people. So I think the nice thing about framing it is, who's the person that the decision is being made about? What's useful for them to know and be able to do? And any assessment should be able to approximate that. I'm just going to go on a small bird walk. Last night, woke up at 3 a.m. Sorry. Maybe it was because the bed wasn't very comfortable. And I was thinking about Cal TPA, Ed TPA, and Fresno's FAST are not the same TPAs. They can be equated. You can talk about how they're similar. They all work off standards, but they're different approaches. And I guess what I'd like to know more about from this group is to answer that question. One of our to-dos, I need to know about what the task demands are for the FAST,
Yeah.
the Cal TPA, and the Ed TPA, because I'm being asked to make global statements about TPA, but I don't know whether valid and authentic to the work of teaching for the FAST is the same as for the Cal TPA or to the Ed TPA, except by someone telling me, well, they all meet the same standards, the same CSDP or TP standards. So I just do want to zoom out a little bit and say, I'm still not quite clear when we say TPA, if I know enough to know whether these different instruments currently as they exist focus on equally the TPEs. Do they put the same amount of emphasis in a cycle of inquiry?
Well, even that, we're getting down to, and they cautioned us against that, but again, we're going
Did I
there
drill down too far?
of like, so what is cycle of inquiry, right? Like that, and you're saying like these things are, again, based in context, right? They're all created from different places and whatnot, but
So I guess I want to say again, just valid for the authentic work of teaching as partly connected to the type of TPA that it is, even if it's so-called standards-based. Because I know that Ed TPA and Cal TPA have different design elements that may or may not be valid to the work of teaching in the same way.
I mean, I've never seen two assessments that are equivalent. So to me, that's like not even a question. I mean, like, you know, I mean, I'm sure if we line up these three, they're not.
Well, there is a study document that was
Yeah.
put into our list that
Yeah.
says there was a study done, I think by Humro,
Mhm.
that tries to equate or connect. And I haven't read it, so I don't
Yeah.
want to, let's
Yeah.
keep going high
Yeah.
level,
Yeah.
but I just want to, like, I noticed I had trouble answering that if I don't know
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
TPA
I want to go
represents.
back to what
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's Jason that you said about just what we learned in the classroom, like theory wise, and like I'd like to think of it as like the ideal versus like reality. It's kind of like research versus life. Like there shouldn't be a difference, but there is. And when I mentor teachers and they're like, well, Linda, like we were taught in class to do this and it should look like this. And I'm like, well, yeah, if you had perfect 12 students in your classroom, like the video had 12 students, and they were all taught how to sit quietly on the rug and they all went to preschool, great. But in reality, you have kids who have never been to school before. You have 3 that are most likely going to need additional assistance. And this is your reality. And sure, you can attempt to do a think, pair, share, and do this, the sequence of the lesson that way. That's ideal. But here's your reality. You have to do X, Y, and Z. And that's part of like the art of teaching.
Yeah.
So when I think about like this at TPA or these tests or for teacher candidates, I feel like it's, I mean, for lack of a better word, it's for the beginning of the career. It's for like the ideal, like the basics you need to know. You need to know how to pull a whole group. You need to know how to do a small group. You need to at least be able to look at data at a very basic level. You know what I mean? You need to be able to expect kids to raise their hands, and you need to be able to project your voice in front of a classroom. Like these are just like the teacher 101 kind of things. But when we delve into like our specific setting, that's experience, and that's not something that can be taught or tested. You know what I mean? I don't know.
I mean, I was thinking about the context. I think there's ways that you can allow for the candidate to provide personalized context that's reflective of their practice or their particular experience. So that was something to add for that context piece that I wrote, is personalized to and reflects teachers' context.
Yeah, there's so many ways to add that qualitative piece in, you know, and it doesn't necessarily make the assessment like too subjective. You know, you can contextualize it, you can like paint a picture of like the educational ecosystem you're in, you know, you can do a lot of different things and then show your work.
I think that's a really strong piece to being valid and authentic.
Yeah.
Right. Is to be for a teacher ability to be able to name who their students are, right, holistically, and then connect that to this is why the choices I'm making in the classroom. I think that's really powerful. I heard the timer go up, so I just wanted to ask the
We've
group
been talking for about 20 minutes now, so that's like our first 20.
if we want to move. Yeah.
So the next one says discuss what you know and have learned about the focus area concepts.
And do we want to keep going in 20-minute chunks, or do you want to just kind of like 15
Well,
and just kind of talk about all of these?
we didn't
We
tackle
cover all of
B, C, and D,
Yeah.
so can we do that somewhat quickly and give
Yeah.
ourselves some time to do that before we jump
Yeah.
into the
Let's
next
do
task?
10 minutes.
Great.
Okay.
So in this section, we're going to be talking about A through E, right? Or no, we're going to
Well,
B
we're
through E.
starting with B.
B through E. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Like formative is Pandora's box.
Yeah.
I'm gonna read my norms.
Yeah. I feel like formative is Pandora's box, and we're gonna get there in the other focus areas again and again and again. So
I think what we've talked about in validity and authenticity is related to formative. It's going to inform our definition of formative. So
I'm just in our notes, right? We have definition concerns with the word formative.
the pieces that I feel like are somewhat unique to focus area 1 that do not come up again in the other conversations later today are appropriate in classroom settings. To be honest, like those constructs, they don't come up again. And so if we could just check in about those, I'd appreciate it today. And the reason those are in D and E, or I'm sorry, in C and D. So we've touched on classroom settings, this idea of reasonable to implement in a wide range of classroom settings. But in my experience in teacher education programs, like the definition and the way that we think about classroom settings is limited in the curriculum as well as in the way that we approach it, in the way that like especially in secondary settings, in the way that we like, for example, like in the special education world, like we think of like the classroom environment as like a teacher in itself. Like in the developmental world, we think of it as like a teacher in itself. In like grades 7 through 12, it's like a like we barely think of it at all, right? In the multiple subject world, it's like an extremely intentional piece. But this idea of like classroom setting is like something to unpack and think about.
At my school specifically, we are a charter school that focuses on inclusion. So my classroom setting for my students is that when I was a classroom teacher, I have five students with significant disabilities and behaviors, and my colleague has a gifted class or has a typical class.
So depending on
very different.
Yes. So depending on your setting, the way that you talk about the classroom environment varies like a lot. So it's worth talking about at some point.
So again, it's the context.
The context. So that word is like a signal for a context conversation, because it'll come up in the assessment.
So if I could circle back to the context problem, I'll be the person pushing off the context problem. Everyone else will be the person pushing it forward. The question I think for a TPA is it sufficiently flexible to capture and to support all the diversity of context you're describing? It needs to be.
Yeah.
It needs to be. So that's one thing. Like, can it do that?
Right.
And then we can argue, does it perfectly do that or does it not? But it should do that.
Right. It should. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that fair? So can we say like, so in a way,
That's
it's like not did it or not, but rather does it have the flexibility to hold the diversity of context?
Right.
To the beginning teacher point, I just wanted to say, I've been doing a lot of work the last 10 years on teacher learning progressions, a concept that didn't make it into the state standard or the state research agenda. But a lot of us are thinking more and more about developmentally sensitive, which is exactly what you were describing for me when I heard you say elementary prep, middle school prep, and high school prep. And I worked in the high school space, single subject. Very different conceptions.
Yeah.
Again, is it flexible enough to allow a high school science teacher to describe the way in which they're doing inclusivity, the way in which they're doing assessment for learning? And I think that would be another problem. It's not that do they get the beginning right or get the category right, but do they allow in the TPA for someone to talk about the developmental contextual issues? And are they prompted to talk about that in a way that validates their experience?
And respond appropriately as a first year teacher.
Which they may not have the concepts even to unpack all that yet. That's one of my concerns for them.
And then it's coupled with the word appropriate. And so I would say like, that's a really loaded word. So are we talking about developmentally appropriate? Are we talking about appropriate to what? So that word, you know, like to me, I assume I make a certain assumptions around that word based on my discipline, you know, but what are we talking about?
So want to replace it to relevant almost.
Well, see, but I don't. I want it to be developmentally appropriate. That's what I, you know what I'm saying? So just because we're having that conversation itself means we have to talk about that.
And again, in terms of bias, I got to read my notes again.
And you want to do something else.
What do I care about? You know, I care about development.
And I'm,
Please.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, like what came into my head with that is like appropriate. Like, is that maybe even just like a place for standard space?
Exactly. So that's why that word is it's loaded. So that's the
we
word. I
have
circled
all
it.
3 different things there.
And I've got to represent my friends from San Jose State who do work with ELD and multilingual and bilingual, and they're going to say appropriate has to be absolutely seen through the lens of not just special ed or gifted.
Well, it's linguistic development. Yeah.
So, and there's a whole bunch of standards just came online around this work, and a lot of testing going on around it. Do our candidates even know how to address
that's
those
my
issues?
Domain as well. It's like, that's it.
So I think you're right. Appropriate's really
To what?
loaded.
Yeah.
Around
It's loaded.
standards within the system, because there are language development standards, not just subject matter standards.
Well, I would like to also I'm questioning just the EdTPA itself. It's one test for K-12, right?
Right.
And is that in itself appropriate? Like, do we need an EdTPA for elementary, middle, and high?
Apparently they did not.
They said no.
Yeah, but I'm just,
yeah,
just throwing that out
yes,
there,
I know.
like,
And Linda,
Yeah.
I just want to keep inviting you into EdTPA is one
yes, I'm
of
sorry,
other
TPA,
TPAs. Yeah, so
Yes,
Cal
TPAs.
TPA is very widespread now.
right,
And then Fresno just has its own.
right, okay, so the TPAs,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's, but again, like,
Yeah.
we have just
Some question.
one, so it's a very, supposed to be very overarching,
Yeah.
it has to be, I hate to use the word generic,
But yeah.
but
Yeah.
it kind of has to be generic enough to
Right.
encompass all the different settings
Yeah.
somehow.
Right.
Like
Yes.
you said, flexibility somehow to encompass all the different settings and settings being including grade level spans and gen ed, special ed, special
Mhm.
programs. So I'm just thinking, and I'm also thinking about, and then this might be going off on a tangent, but like we had seen in there, like, oh, I didn't know that we could not bypass the TPAs, but that there's a portfolio option. And I'm just thinking, is that portfolio option maybe the better option if we're thinking about authentic?
Right.
When
Right?
I graduated in
Could be an irony.
2008, which was the year that the TPAs got, so I literally just missed it. But for my project as a candidate, I created a portfolio and then took that portfolio of all the TPAs to all of my interviews and was like my evidence of, look at all this wonderful work that I've done throughout the year, and why do we now have to limit it to a test? Because now I'm like showing you what's happening. And I think similarly, this should lead to standards-based for credentialed candidates, and then offer, like, after the standards-based part, offer some scenario or some sort of output that describes the situation or the context of the classroom, and then applies it to the standards somehow. Right.
Yeah, and then people are mentioning alternatives and portfolios, and we know that FAST at Fresno decided to create its own, I don't know what the appropriate word would be, but legitimate, one that has been accepted by the commission. Let's be clear, San Jose State was thinking about creating its own. The amount of money, time, effort, energy, our dean didn't want to spend that money.
Yeah.
So I think there's even equity questions around
Yes.
who can create a TPA alternative and who can't. And I think one of the things that's ironic is this is supposed to be a portfolio-based assessment, and you just referred to it personally, what we often do. Test. We're calling it a test. And most people think of tests as multiple choice,
Yeah.
subjective, quote unquote test. Ironically, we're back full circle to, this is supposed to be a portfolio video of writing, of unit plans, of lesson plans, of discussions, of student work.
Right.
I mean, I think that was the whole concept of the TPA.
Can you convert that into a question?
Yeah, okay.
How do
For
we,
number three, for the notes.
how do we ensure that we have similar parts inside of what we're calling the portfolio and the TPA? How would we connect the dots between what goes into the evidence you just described? Because I do think when you talk about things like appropriate or reasonable, you're asking people to show evidence of something, and then you're asking to collect it somewhere, and then you want someone to evaluate that collection, whether it's you and your employer or whether it's
I'm sorry, appropriate, I just
Yeah.
lost it. Okay, you're asking appropriate and this is,
so appropriate and reasonable all will come back to what's the evidence.
and evidence, I'm sorry,
So
reasonable.
just stick with that. What's
Okay.
the evidence we're discussing? TPAs are collections of evidence, I think.
And yet sometimes I've heard of,
Yeah.
of it, again, going back to, is this valid and authentic to the people that are doing this? And I've had, new teachers like describe the experience of like everybody just coming into a room and like sitting down with their notes from their university courses and just writing out what they think is supposed to be happening on these TPAs.
Oh,
Right? And even that within different universities, I've seen discrepancy between, having a support group like that and not having support groups like that. Again, like, it's interesting because if it is meant to be like a portfolio experience, again, that's also thinking about university timeline, right? Like
Mhm.
I've had a number of new teachers talking about, I wish that my university would pace this out more
Mhm.
appropriately
Mhm.
so that it's not a test at the end of the
Or embedded in
year.
classwork, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
But then how much classwork and coursework do you want to take away to
Yeah.
spend on this? And depending on the institution, how much emphasis on the actual inquiry process reflection is happening? So I guess one of my questions is how is this communicated and disseminated to the different institutions when
That's even one of those things,
discussing
right?
how to implement the portfolio assessment part.
Well,
Yeah.
if it's valid and authentic to the work of teaching and appropriate for credential candidates, you could embed it and it would be great to
Right.
be in the, because it should be embedded, you know, it would make perfect sense.
Right.
It wouldn't be taking away anything.
Right, and it would be then authentic
Yep.
to the context of the
Right.
classroom and the situation that you're currently
Yeah.
in.
Focus
it's-
area
it's-
3 talks about that, so
Oh,
we will
okay.
definitely get that to them,
Great.
right? Ensure programs embed
Yeah.
assessment and coursework in
Yep.
clinical work.
Exactly.
I guess I did have a bit of an
Well,
epiphany, so I'll
yeah.
say it again to make sure it's in the notes. I don't think I can answer the concepts without knowing what the evidence is.
Yeah, right.
So I'm asking, what's the relationship between evidence to support the claim that I understand the concept? I don't mean that like as a downer. I mean, like,
What is the?
what is the evidence
Uh-huh.
that I'm doing something valid and authentic? What is the evidence that it's formative in nature of the candidate? What is
Okay,
the
you gotta go a
evidence?
little slower. What is the evidence?
Just
that
what
I'm
is the
doing-
evidence?
What is the evidence that I'm doing something valid and
Authentic.
authentic?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It was listening to focus area
Yeah.
concepts. What's the evidence that?
I'm sorry, what is it?
And we
Saying,
should
what is
rotate
this?
roles with each
Yeah.
hour. I
So
think,
I'll
'cause
stop
that's a
now,
lot.
but
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a lot of note taking. You're right.
But
I'm gonna
the
go.
idea
use
is-
I'm just
Right.
typing, I'm gonna have to move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
5 more minutes.
It's what is the evidence
Okay.
to help
Yeah,
answer any of
yeah.
these.
I mean, I'm just taking notes as we're talking in timeline now. Just because we were starting to talk about that, to the word formative, because I like what we're saying about how, we want to be valid, we want to be doing all these things contextually, but the problem is there's a pass or fail
Yeah.
at the end of this. And if we're looking at formative shouldn't be pass or fail.
No.
You know what I mean? And if you take the TPAs, they don't even want you to, you're not allowed to resubmit something. So like if they have an issue that your grader has an issue with a certain section of your TPA, then it's like they give you very vague feedback, and then you can't submit the same thing, which I think that defeats the whole purpose of formative,
Right.
because you should be able to look at your grade notes or the grading feedback and be like, oh, okay, then I need to adjust that piece. I need to grow and learn from this and be able to submit it back and say, hey, I took your feedback. Now I'm going to revise it. Here you go. Please take a second look.
Yeah. So that part needs
So-
to be.
You add that to the.
That's kind of where I think like that, you know, and I know that I don't think it's allowed, right? It's like the coaching aspect of like, how powerful would that be if you got feedback on your portfolio and be able to, you know, have like a coaching experience around like, this is what this feedback really meant in your classroom, right? Like, this is what it actually looks like in front of students. That would be super cool.
So anecdotally, I've taught the TPA cycle 2 in our phase 1 seminar. That means our clinical practice at San Jose State. That means when we go in and we work with a candidate in the actual school site as well as in the university. And we did use video formatively. We did ramp up how to do video for the components and analyze one's performances prior to the actual TPA submission.
Right. And I did that
In other words,
my-
we embedded it inside of our coursework for clinical practice where we said you shouldn't just do TPA at the end. You
Right.
should be looking at video as a form of practice. So I guess the question I would like to put in
Just
there
totally jumped the
is,
shark.
for example, with video,
Getting back.
how formative is that? Or is that something that we could think about as a place for embedding? So
It would
again, how
seem
to
like
answer
the
formative
the
is a one
TPA would have to require that formative process is happening within the teacher prep program, because and I'm interested to learn more about the university routes, but I actually did the LACO, Los Angeles County of Education District Intern Program. So I was a classroom teacher.
Before you were a classroom teacher.
Yeah, before I was a classroom teacher, doing all the training. And similar for the TPA, it was part of our assignments. And the professor is a person who's like giving the feedback to, like, we're going to make sure that you are going to pass it. So you are submitting it to us and you're getting the feedback and then making the revisions. And so that they are confident that once you submit it, so that was the formative process was like attached into, but my courses, but I don't know if that's required in the TPA.
Right, yeah.
And that would make it formal, because if the TPA as is, it's right, it's not ongoing, constructive, low stakes. So my question would be, is that already a requirement that it
is the preparation for the video, the preparation for TPA formative act in teaching, in programs, in teacher programs, in teacher prep programs.
I like what Jason said, by the way, e.g. low stakes, or what were your definitions of formative?
ongoing,
constructive. I think that's worth putting down. Ongoing, constructive.
low
Pause
stakes.
notes. We got a little post-it note on here. I just wanted to get to the group. Return to main room at 11:50 a.m. We will discuss if additional time is needed after lunch.
So
Yeah,
it is.
because what basically what we're saying, or what you just said, was just exactly it. Like the teaching prep program, if you're preparing for the TPA, that process can be, if you're at a good university, formative. But again, you're telling teacher candidates, like, look, we're watching your video, we're going through it, we're giving you feedback, we're doing all those things in preparation for the TPA so that you can pass the TPA. But at the end of the day, the TPA is summative. It is pass or fail. It is that. And I think that's where you have issues with, you're prepping teachers on this level that you can give feedback and you can make yourself better. But then now you're giving them a test that they can't make better, and that now they don't get to be a teacher, and now they have to prep a whole new video and a whole new whatever if they fail it. And I think that's the part that's a major issue, because you're sending a mixed message to candidates, like, and you're not really prepping them, and the whole feedback is just not even for you to be a better teacher when you're saying pass or fail at this point.
So I was going to say that's the perfect segue to move on to focus area 2, because it is asking for recommendations for how programs might embed this assessment into coursework and clinical work to avoid duplicate work for candidates, but also that would be a time to think about how to make like possible changes like this, because we could-
Implementation changes.
exactly,
Communicating with the institutions to say
all of this
these things need
this
to be
could
met.
fold into that conversation too, if you wanted to
Let's make the pivot.
pivot
Was,
to
did
two.
we
Yeah.
want identify any sources that we would need to support our deliberation? I know you mentioned you want to be able to see
The different TPA components for all the 3 that we have, so that we could deliberate. How much video work is going on? What kind of video work is going on? Because that helps me to answer authentic to the work of teaching really easily. Like some video work is not authentic to the work of teaching.
because you have attributes for evidence-based.
There you go.
Discuss that.
There you go.
The residents my residents this year at Cal State Northridge, they have first semester is their trial TPA, and then the second semester they like actually work towards, so they can give feedback and still go through the cycle. However, the candidates that were in there still felt it took away from a lot of actual instruction. So they did get that section of training you to take they did like a practice TPA as the first semester. So they were giving them a lot of support. However, at the end of it, the candidates were still saying this is a complete waste of time. So so I'm not sure how to bridge that.
Throw that into the
I did. But at the end of it is like this, all of our students are saying we shouldn't do this. So how then do we communicate to the institutions that this is valid, this is good work to embed within your programs to make it not feel like a waste of time, because some institutions are doing it differently and some
Okay, so my notes, I
Thinking out
put,
loud.
this is one of my notes, I'm sorry. Candidates
Great
feel
job.
stressed and saying we shouldn't have to take TPAs and it was a waste of time.
Sorry, that's part of my recommendations on how to embed it into coursework where it doesn't feel irrelevant to the practice and learning of
So are
developing
we in
teachers.
focus area too?
We're in, yes, we're
All right.
in focus area too. We have, yeah, recommendations and also embedding and.
So-
Did anyone need the break or we all did?
Yeah.
Forgot we even had one. So I just looking at focus area concepts, 1A, embed the assessments into coursework and clinical work. And we heard yesterday that for the PAC, there was actually an entire infrastructure and conference settings and professional development workshops. And that was a long time ago. We're no longer in that world. So I guess the question is how, but we don't have to do how. We just have to talk about what we mean and have some exemplars, which we did.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm lost at where you're at. We're around.
Focus area
two,
2,
right
focus
here.
area concepts 1A. That one, embed the assessments into coursework.
Wait, what am I looking at?
In our job.
Am I on the
is,
wrong document?
No.
No, I'm
Um,
on the wrong document. I apologize.
Can I
Okay,
just
sorry.
clarify, our
Thank
job
you.
is to generate questions and to discuss concepts, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what we're doing?
Yeah.
We're
Or
generating
are we still on
questions.
round 1?
Yeah.
Round
No,
two.
I think
Oh,
we,
we're
I think we
on round
transitioned to round 2,
Yeah.
focus area 2. So we're brainstorming possible attributes of the focus area
Right.
concepts. And that's what you're doing
Okay.
I'm trying, yeah.
with
Yeah.
2A. And then we
Okay.
want to be able to discuss what we know and learn about the focus area concept, identify questions to which you would like responses, and identify sources
Okay.
to
But
support
the
deliberation.
concepts are here,
Yeah,
right?
this is
And
what
the
we're doing.
concepts
This
are
is what we're
in
looking at.
here.
And we're
you're
focusing on
reading,
embed the assessments.
Into coursework and clinical work.
Yeah.
So,
Attributes.
yeah, and then the other two as well, right? Avoid
Okay.
duplicative work for candidates and to the extent, to the maximum feasible extent, each performance assessment shall be ongoing and blended into the preparation program, which sounds a lot like A.
You know, one of my questions, I'm sorry, we,
Oh, just trying to get us,
yeah, one of my questions around this, and again, these are, my brain goes to always what if questions,
Mhm.
is, you know, like how national boards, like, I didn't do national boards for a really long time because it was like super long and expensive and, but then in our district, they broke it up into little bite-sized pieces that people could like, you know, break off. I also wonder about that with TPAs, like what if it wasn't this long, year-long process, right? But what if it was like broken into little pieces where you could pass like different pieces at a time and you could get like university
Mhm.
supervising, coaching, whatever, you know, with different sections.
Yeah.
And then by the end of the school year, if you haven't passed all of your pieces, right?
I like the idea of like pedagogy, classroom, like clinical implementation, or like breaking it off into sections of what is the work of teaching. And then kind of scaffolded towards the final, like, okay, now you're ready. You've passed all these benchmarks. I like that idea.
So back to differences
But
between
how?
TPAs.
Yeah.
My understanding, having been on the design team for cycle 1 and 2 of the Cal TPA, is exactly that premise
Ah, okay.
of breaking it into 2 parts. Ed TPA, more like the PAC, as I understand it, is really more of a
So you're
less
saying-
broken up, or you could break it up and you could develop a program to do that, but there are actually 2 things you turn in, cycle 1, cycle 2. So it's again, this idea of like kind of not knowing what the moving parts of these TPAs are. It's also hard to really theorize, talk about being too theoretical. But we're asking for breaking it up, scaffolding, is that what you're saying? Making sure that it has chunks.
So Cal
Yeah,
TPA does that, but
I-
Ed TPA
It
doesn't?
may do
And
that.
that's.
May
and
do
that's
that.
my
We need to figure this out
Okay, yeah,
together, but
no,
it
that goes
may
back
do
to your
that. How do
My
we
question.
work on it?
experience has just been with Ed TPA, so like.
I just took the TPA, so it is one big chunk.
Right,
Yeah.
and Cal TPA is not. We designed it specifically not to do that. So again, we're back to
So
this,
that-
like, we got TPAs here and there.
Implementation.
Is that getting into solutions?
It is,
A
yes, but it's
recommendation?
also a question
question.
or a recommendation of
Yeah.
like how, I guess that would be.
How it was organized.
Right.
And also, is there evidence that like again, the differences of the TPAs, is there evidence that there's strengths in breaking it into
I
chunks
wonder-
versus not?
Are
I love
there
that question.
survey responses? I saw survey responses for some TPAs, but I don't know if it was past
We should
Cal
know.
TPA
We should
or
know.
Ed TPA and what their
Mhm.
experiences were, because there were some that was like pointless, don't do it, So it's waste of time on the TPAs, but I don't know which TPA
Yeah,
specific. So
that's-
that
we
would be
need to
good
know that.
information to know if it's
Yeah,
Cal
we could
TPA, Ed
disaggregate
TPA,
it.
or
Disaggregate,
FAST.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll look.
But I think the principle is it would be more authentic to the work of teaching and maybe even living the work of this performance assessment if we could break it up in a way that it was manageable.
Yeah.
So knowing more about
I know, because I know there's a lot of conversation that I hear from people around also just, again, if you want to talk about equity in testing, right? Like who is passing, who is not, and how do we support, you know, again, we teach with UBL in mind. How do we assess teachers in a similar way?
Right.
And also consider like multilingual learners,
Right.
yes.
you know, is writing all your stuff the best way to assess, right? Just, I mean, it seems, yeah, it seems like there are a lot of creative solutions in classrooms that we could build off strengths with students to be able to understand how to do this with adults in teaching.
One of my experiences with portfolio assessment in New York City, which gave a lot of birth to the idea of pro portfolio assessment, was that we had an oral examination that went along with the written portion of a portfolio for high school students. And I was just in Queensland this summer in Australia, and they have a massive oral component. The teacher candidate shows the work, but they also have a chance to use language. And that could even be translanguage, and that could be even things like multilingual possibilities. The point being, they have flexibility in their examination system to include other modalities than just writing. Just thinking about, like, if we were to make recommendations, why aren't there local-based committees that are talking through the TPA judgment? Well, we've outsourced it to raters. But one way you could think about it is bringing it back to a more interactive, moderated view of, hey, talk about this thing you did, or let's look at that video. Why don't you explain what was going on? Think about how much we've limited this into a writing experience.
Thank you.
And when you hear people complain, they're often complaining about the writing. But if you said, I'm going to sit you down with 4 committee members from your local institution plus 1 person coming from wherever, let's interview you for an hour with your TPA in front of us. But just outside the box, we've kind of been stuck in this mode. We could say communication's critical.
Similar to defending a thesis.
Yes. Which is, again, the heart of what the work was in the 90s, but we've sort of lost a lot of that for efficiency, for scaling, to get bigger and bigger.
Well, that goes also back to like the teacher programs, because I know in the district intern program, they do have, they have to pass an interview, a portfolio, an interview of sorts, I forget what it's called, a forum, but all the candidates are expected to present but that's part of the program, that's outside of the TPAs. And so I guess my question is, do we include something like that in the TPAs, or is that something we want to add on to the teaching program? Because the TPAs shouldn't be so high stakes if teaching programs did what they needed to do. You know what I mean?
But I think we're setting the expectation for the state of California of what all teachers need, right? So what determination? Because now that's what we're calling for, right? We're setting the standard for what the institutions will expect.
I mean, I'm just, I think it's a both and. I
Yeah.
think we can actually imagine the TPA as a standard across the state, and then we can imagine localized ways of doing oral or interactive with the written component.
One of the questions I had was when they say local scoring, I wanted to know what that means.
Yeah, good question.
I like all the ideas and the different possibilities, and that's things that we have to do in the classroom as well, right? I don't want to just, because a student couldn't show me it in this particular way, their understanding, I want to be able to give them other opportunities. So I'm like, oh no, they do understand the concepts. Just whatever reason I got to work with you on making these presentations or, the writing. I know focus area 2 says recommendations for how programs. I'm just for C, like it says, each performance assessment shall be ongoing and blended into the preparation program. And so my question is, again, just curious, like, how is that language being communicated in the TPA that this is expected of the programs?
Great. Thanks for modeling how to write a question. Say a question.
Okay, now I'm gonna need you to repeat that.
Yeah.
It's being recorded.
Play the tape.
What is it that you said? How is it communicated?
Yeah, how is it communicated as a part of the TPA? How is it communicated
That it
to
should be blended into the
preparation programs that should be embedded and blended?
Yeah, that's a good one. The
Jason-
maximum feasible extent.
Yeah, that's what I
And
emphasize.
why would it
Maximum feasible extent.
Yeah, that's a
maximum
question.
feasible extent?
Maximum feasible extent.
But what's feasible to me.
Yes. What does that mean?
Yeah,
That's
no,
my
no.
question.
Yeah. What does that mean?
And that's way different across
Sounds
the
like union
UCs, Cal
language.
States. Yeah.
Sure does.
Yeah, because I mean, we could interpret that to mean that like we're modeling some of these things. So instead of like lecturing about UDL, we actually blend it into and model UDL in our
strategies, yeah.
assessment and the way we deliver instruction. And then also we expect our candidates to do in their own, their teaching and clinical practice.
Yeah.
To Brent's point, that
Yes.
maximum feasible depends on your institution.
It
does.
What they can
does.
afford and their policies and
Right.
structures.
Yeah.
And again, best practices or good practices or practices, just
Right.
what's going on.
Right.
So one thing we need to know, here's a question for the commission, which I think would be hard for all of us without a big study.
Mhm.
Do we really know how programs are embedding? Do we know if programs are embedding the,
Or calibrated in that. I think that's another
and
question.
I'm just separate before calibrated, just
Yeah.
implementing, embedding
Yeah.
these components inside a program. Don't even know.
Mhm.
Right.
Is there a study? Is there a
Right.
report? Is there a survey?
And to
Accountability.
some people, it's going to be my maximum feasible extent is I had a
I love how you're
discussion
giving
about
me
it at the
all
start of my
mixed
course.
research projects.
I was
right
just
now.
gonna say,
I know
this
you and I are
happened to
all.
me,
what?
Al, last one was- but I-
Well, I'm just thinking different institutions are going to say, like, I don't have money to continue to offer a different course or hire another person to make sure that it's blended into our program. But I'm going to spend 15 minutes at the start of my class and say, okay, that's my maximum feasible extent compared to Alder, who's down the street and has a lot more money than Kelsey.
So now we're looking at equity.
Right. I think that's definitely, because that even just within the two university partnerships that I know of that we do in our residency program, that's definitely a question of what is feasible to one university versus feasible to another university. And, how do you make that standard? Well, that's where the calibration, right? How do you make that standardized and fair for,
Yeah.
candidates, just because I choose to go to one university versus the other,
Right. Yeah.
then you're getting a whole other.
And I would ask this in terms of norms, some things I hear sometimes thrown around. I think we have to be really careful about characterizing private versus public, or UC versus CSU, or Alder versus LEA. Frankly, I don't know enough to know what I don't know about what CSUs down the street are doing and what I'm doing. And so I would just say, I think a space of holding. Let's inquire.
Yeah.
Let's learn.
Those are my two relevant schools. That's why I got
Yeah, I know. No, you're not alone. I do this all the
Yeah,
time.
right,
We
yeah.
do this. We're also San Jose State. We do it
Yeah.
better than everybody else. I mean, you have all that going on.
Yeah.
But let's just. I want to go to this tough one because we're in a public meeting with public folks here. I did notice that we kind of ran past, or I ran past, focus area concept B. Avoid duplicative work for candidates. Now, I just want to say, I don't have a question yet. Sorry, y'all. I'm just going to say my feelings first. I've been in this business for 15 years at San Jose State, teaching a lot of different teacher candidates. And I've never talked in a good conversation with any of my student teachers who didn't tell me there's a lot of duplicative work in my program. I have to write 4 different lesson plans again and again in different classes that I take. And I don't know why. It's not just the TPA that is being critiqued for duplicative work.
Right.
Programs that deliver content in core concept and subject areas are being critiqued. If you're listening as a professor or a lecturer or anybody who's teaching the program, they're telling you, I'm doing this stuff over and over again. Why? And part of the reason we have to answer why is a A lesson plan that's looking at it from the point of view of ed psych is different than one that's looking at it from the
Right.
point of view of assessment or language
Mhm.
development.
Yep.
You're looking at different lenses on the question, what is a good lesson plan?
Yep.
So I guess my point is, again, we are giving too much up to the candidates who are saying it's duplicative.
Right.
If we don't note that they're saying that in all sorts of spaces in teacher education. So it's our job, I think, to educate and be educative. I just don't hang that on the TPA only. So what is my question? What specifically do they feel is duplicative? And can the commission or others give us some insight into the nature of the duplicity or duplicativeness? Sorry. I think
Yeah.
that's the.
My question was for us. What do you guys consider, and even in your experience, duplicative work within either the prep programs? Well, these are recommendations for the programs. So what is duplicative, like in our experience or your own definitions that you've noticed in?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
I felt my BITSA program was duplicative.
Yeah.
And as a starting beginning teacher, I was like, didn't I just do this? I was constantly like going back to my TPAs. How can I just reuse this over here? And
That's a
Well,
benefit
I
to
think-
TPA.
No,
Yeah.
I had a colleague literally show me a research paper she wrote on inclusion, and she was like, "Oh, look at this! I've used this 4 times now in 4 different classes."
Well, I think that's relevant to what I was saying earlier, where it's the difference between a credential candidate and a teacher. So like the redundance for me similarly is was a complete repetition of what I just did in my portfolio. And I'm doing the same thing again with the students in front of me, where it's relevant to the students. But yeah, I don't know how to then.
Because the challenge for me was, as a district intern, I was actually with my students. So for my TPA and the BITSA,
It's the same.
That's pretty
It's
unique.
the same, right? Well, it wasn't the same for me. However, the analysis of what you're doing as a beginning teacher should be different than what you're doing as a
Developmentally.
developing or a credential candidate, I should say, because beginning teachers are also developing teachers as well.
Yeah.
So
So did we get the
I don't know
query
what's
about
the-
what the duplicative?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a statement. So I have no way to validate this statement about
well, I
who
guess we
said
could
what and why.
also
Yeah.
ask what induction expectations are relevant to what credential candidates would be.
Yeah.
What
That-
standards
What
for,
induction?
Yeah.
what are the difference in
That seems
standards
good,
between
actually, 'cause when
TPAs
I
and
think about it,
induction?
it's like
Because if we're doing the same thing with
my experience
undergrad
is from the
or
program
with
level.
credential
because
work
I
as
hear about
induction.
that. For me,
So what are you finding?
I was
duplicative?
just gonna say, I'm having this moment where I'm like, no, actually, my personal experience is, it does have to do with lenses, because I'll say, like, for example, I'll be teaching a class on restorative practices from like a sociocultural perspective or a historical political perspective. And then a student will say, well, we just did this, or, and it's actually, but they did it in like from a practitioner's perspective in another class. And say, no, we're talking big picture in here. Like we're contextualizing it in here. And you were actually doing it in there, so we're talking about it again, but in a very different way, so it is not, we're not duplicating it, and so that's my experience. So that's their lack of,
They're
insight.
novices.
Grab my
So-
charger.
So, but indirectly, it's like we're on the street, like that kind of thing.
It's kind of like Daniel's son
actual.
from Mr. Miyagi. Why am I waxing on and waxing off
Yeah,
every day?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Everyone enjoys that and they find
Yeah.
it funny.
Yeah.
But I guess the lesson plan's not as fun as waxing on or waxing off of a
Right.
car.
Yeah.
The sad thing, I think, is that we're struggling right now, again, to better understand why this is in front of us as a group. Somebody said somewhere, avoid duplicative work for candidates. I'm just curious, where did these quotes come from? Can we write that in the notes?
Well, I think it might be the survey responses.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, and then
Because
so
there's
how do we
200
unpack?
pages.
So how do we drill down? How do we drill down on the survey responses? I don't know what those things mean. It was just a statement and I strongly agreed with it.
Yeah, I'm kind of feeling, I don't know, make it a vague space with that. And
It's 10:50, well, almost 10:50.
So move
I
to the
think,
next one.
oh, no.
I think it's probably enough to say, like, there's a lot of ways to think about that, and like,
Well-
not to assume that necessarily it's so, and that it could mean, like, it's a matter of perception on behalf of the
Exactly.
candidate, and that maybe it could mean that it's a matter of lenses, it could mean this, it could mean, you know, like, and really taking a look and seeing what it does mean, you know, and so, you know, maybe there's like some piece that we're not considering, and what is it? So, you know, so I don't know. just- yeah,
Again, I'm just finding myself in a
yeah,
Want to move on?
Yeah.
thing with
yeah.
that,
We don't
but
have to solve it.
well, yeah, no, what I want to say
Yeah.
is that, you know, again, perspectives, that's in the
Mhm.
explicitness of that with teachers, and again, that could be influencing that, but also, you know, just this concept, and again, the idea with BITSA or induction or whatnot, again, that is also a perception of how that gets, you know, translated to teachers or disseminated, right? Like, you know, you can have someone who as a mentor come in and say, okay, let's sit down and let's just do these tools and get them checked the boxes and do that. And then you could also have a mentor who comes in and is like, you know, we're actually going to have involved in an inquiry cycle.
Mm.
What are you curious about in your classroom? You know, coaching aspect of that, and that's, you know, would have a lens that would not feel duplicative. It would be actually reinforcing reflective teaching, which I feel like, again, connects to, you know, the context of the students, right? And why, you know, the lesson plan that you did last year, you know, may not fit the classroom that you're in this year, kind of thing. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
I'm looking at like what we're doing right now and just listening to all of our conversation. Like we're all educators, and we're looking at really big picture. And I think I'm struggling right now with, we're looking at TPAs, and we're already jumping into great conversations about the credentialing process, the almost accreditation process, you know, and I guess my big question is, what is the purpose of TPAs? Like, is it just a test that formalizes this whole process at the end? Or is it a gateway to say, oh my God, this is our last chance to stop bad teachers from becoming teachers? Like what is the TPA? Because I feel like we're placing a lot of emphasis on this one assessment. You know what I mean? Whereas I feel like our bigger, more global issue is the accreditation process, because now we have online classes, and I'm going to smile and say I did my multiple subject just recently because I'm a special ed teacher forever, and I did pick an online class because I am a busy individual. I did want to just fast track myself. I've been teaching for so long, and I'm taking classes that are like, this is how you write a lesson plan, like shoot me. But I did that on purpose, but did I know it was the most effective? I knew it wasn't as effective as me showing up to a university, sitting in a class with a professor in front of me and a group of real people. I just wanted to and be done. And that was a choice I made, and I paid for it really well. But again, like, you know what I mean? I know I wasn't going to get the best teacher prep program. But again, in my situation, I didn't need to. I'm a 20+ year teacher. You know what I'm saying? So like, I just think, like, what is the purpose of the TPA, and how much emphasis do we need to place on the TPA? Because, and that's why I asked the question of like, what's the purpose of us revising, or if we need to revise the TPA? Like, what are the concerns right now with the TPA? Like, do we need a higher passing rate because we are stopping teachers from entering the profession because they can't pass this test? Is our issue that teaching programs aren't embedding enough that this test is something so foreign to them? Like, after they do a program, you know, no one ever asked them to make a video, and all of a sudden they have to do a video, you know what I mean? So I'm just, I guess my big question is, what is the TPA supposed to, what's the purpose of the TPA? What is its purpose? Like, why do we care? Why do we have it? And are we placing too much emphasis on it, or do we need to place more emphasis on it? Like, does the TPA need to be something big and global that needs to be submitted throughout these year or 2 years in a program, where we keep adding pieces to it, so that at the end we have a final product that says, yeah, you're a qualified teacher because you did do an oral whatever, you did do a video, you did get feedback, you did, you know what I mean? Like,
And that probably would that answer to that question would be interesting to ask the different stakeholders and
Mm.
users, like,
Yeah.
right? It's
Mhm.
probably different for
Yeah.
university supervisors, to teachers, to,
Faculty at the
Mhm.
university.
like even down to like parents, students and families, right? Like
Mhm.
if students and families were, you were asked that question, I wonder what the answer might be to that, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, that would be an interesting study. What's the answer to that question from all the different
Right.
stakeholders? Should we move on to the next
Mhm.
block? Do we need a break? There's
So
another.
it looks like there's, well, we're running behind, but there was a 10-minute one built in for between round 2 and round 3.
Oh, good job,
initially.
guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we take a
Like
break? Should we
to
take a
get-
5-minute
Let's
break?
take that. I'm gonna
Yeah.
get some water.
Yeah.
How
So
much
we're right
time?
there in focus area 3.
Yeah, because we did
You wanna
the
start
other
at 11?
focus areas in less than that.
Start at
1 hour.
11,
10:55.
5? Yeah, that would be a 3-minute break.
Okay.
All right.
Are we?
We
Alright,
are
we're
on
on
number
focus
3.
Yeah,
3.
focus area 3. We're doing good, guys. We're doing
Yes, we
good.
are.
Okay, focus area 3.
Alright. 10:50 to 11. Okay, so good, yeah.
Yeah, we're good.
So it's recommendations to strengthen the accreditation program, right? Is that, and I listened to the right
Linda,
thing?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you've done a lot of typing. Do you feel comfortable continuing?
No, actually, I would rather not.
Do you
I just feel it's hard for me to focus on the conversation, type, and then be able to give input.
Do you want to switch? If you want to hand me your laptop, I can.
Okay,
I'm happy to
do you-
switch it to.
Do you want the mouse or no? Yeah. Okay, I'll take the mouse out.
I'm not as good as at taking, so I'll just repeat a lot. Okay?
I just started bullet pointing because we
That's
move
fine.
around a lot, so just everything's a big bullet point at this
I'm gonna
point.
Give you the 5
So-
minute or the 10 minute.
Okay. so-
Focus area 3 says recommendations to strengthen the accreditation system to ensure programs embed the assessment and coursework and clinical work, offer sufficient clinical and pedagogical support, and support candidates to pass the assessment. The focus area concepts. Well, actually, I think it's worth reading the part underneath this. The commission shall report the number of programs with low pass rates and assist these programs to use evidence-based strategies. We already tagged that earlier this morning.
Mhm.
To support candidates to pass the assessment for all administrations of the assessment. There shall be no fees to the candidates for these instructional supports. So that's clear from also code.
So, just for clarity, from what I understand of that, it means you are going to get support in passing the TPA as a student of the credential program included in your tuition. Right? You do not have to pay additional fees to get support in completing and passing the TPA.
Right, so
Right? And so it's not additional support you didn't pass. I'm gonna give you additional support and you don't have to pay for it, or is this
I think you should write that
everybody
as,
gets?
I think you should write that down
Okay.
as a bullet point.
Okay.
Because that was my same question, because like it's saying here, for me, I feel like
Sorry,
there's no fees for the
moving to
candidate,
PC.
but like the university can easily spend that, like, oh, but you need to be a university student, so therefore, we're not gonna charge you for this service, but we need to put you in a 1-unit class, and you're still gonna pay
Right.
$700
Right.
to maintain your university status, you know what I mean? So I feel like, what does no fees to the candidate really mean?
Yeah.
And I see no fees to the candidates for these instructional supports. I don't see
Yeah.
for the actual
You
TPA.
have to pay for it.
You have to pay for the TPA. It
Okay.
says like if you don't pass, it's the
Right.
supports,
Right,
That are not.
and the TPA
Right.
can be pricey.
right? So it's like if you don't pass, you don't have to pay for the supports.
So can we also register in the question section?
Yep.
What do we mean by evidence-based strategies?
Yep.
Yes,
And what do we mean by support?
yeah, what do these supports look like?
Mhm.
And are these supports universal? Because if you're saying that as a
Right.
blanket statement to all
Yep.
candidates who don't pass, they're at different
Yeah,
universities.
what's the support?
Yeah, so what is the support? And is it the same support that you're giving every
Yep.
non-passing candidate?
Exactly. What do we mean by support? And, yeah.
Yeah, my most recent experience with that was that a candidate had to take one of those 1-unit, or had to take a course because they didn't pass and that was
So then they did have
the
to pay.
secondary piece. So that, and then again, that was something that was newer, that was introduced this year, in particular to one university. But again, like you're saying, is that, like, what does that look like?
What does the additional support look like?
Mhm. And how is that calibrated against around all the universities?
And then low pass rates, what is low pass rates?
Yeah.
Like, is that a 20% passing rate? Because what is the TPA's passing rate right now?
Well, I also think
Mhm.
it's relevant to talk about what the EdTPA, the CalTPA, and the FAST
you.
Exactly.
passing rates are.
Right. And remember that we're considering different populations of
Yeah.
folks. In other words, the FAST, the Fresno State, is just for their candidates.
Right.
How do I compare their passing rate on that instrument?
What is Fresno's passing rate? Do you know?
I don't know, we
No,
can
that's
ask.
our question.
But my
Oh,
question is
There
also,
was a
how do you,
resource that
yeah, how do
had
we
that on
compare it?
there, right? I think we
Yeah,
have
we
a
do.
resource.
Oh,
that-
really?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think, well, at least from survey results, right?
That's
Of
up.
like,
Catch up.
I
yeah.
think they disagree. So on the evidence base, I'd also add a question, who is curating these evidence-based practices? In other words, who decides what an
Which is-
evidence-based practice
which is the
is? Not
best
only what is
strategy
it, but
too. Yeah.
who decides?
Yep.
That goes back to equity, because if I think, oh,
Right.
this is evidence-based, turns out it's really not. You think it isn't. Could that hurt a candidate? Could that help a candidate? I don't know.
Al, what was your question?
Well, I'm wondering about the accountability piece for the low pass rates. I'm wondering where and with who it lies, you know?
Mm.
So this idea of like, you know, we've got support for candidates, we've got evidence-based strategies, we've got low pass rates. It's like who's passing, who's not passing. What are the evidence-based strategies? Who decides what they are? What are the supports? Where are the supports? How much are the supports? Who's responsible? Right? Where is the accountability? Where it does it lie with the institution? Does it fall on the individual? Like if we have an inequitable system, like how does that function? No, I mean, you don't have to write it,
No,
but
no,
just
no.
like, let's think it, I just want to
My
say it. And then we'll-
Fingers are also like not used to this keyboard, so I'm like trying to entering numbers. and,
Yeah,
like-
no, I'm just thinking out loud so I can just say it and then we can
Thank you,
think
yeah.
about it. But it's like, you know, that whole accountability piece around all of this, like, you know, that accountability piece.
Yep.
So,
And again, we've been given, I think, documentation, which I haven't yet reviewed, but I intend to review intensively before I get here to the next meeting
yeah.
regarding low pass rates. So if we disaggregate the concept of low pass rate, if we break it apart, are we looking at racial and ethnic lenses? Are we looking at socioeconomic status lenses? Are we looking at language learner and language identified candidates? Those people who decide to identify themselves, those who haven't. These are real differences that may even go together. They may have to be separate.
And I also want to add, just based on what you just said, but even just looking at which candidates, not just their demographics, but like we talked about context, like are the high school teachers maybe not passing and the elementary teachers are?
Right.
Because we experienced that a lot with the RECA. The ones who taught elementary school knew more about reading than, you know, high school teachers did and middle school teachers. So there was that, you know.
And in which program?
And by subject too.
And,
Yes.
and in which context too, are they doing their placements, you know, so.
The survey results that I saw were only based in like percentage points of like who may have passed above like a point or below a point.
Yeah,
I
they
think.
were taking a look to see like if we
But they
just
did
like
not break
move the,
into
yeah,
all
if we
those
move the
different
bar, how many more would we
spaces.
capture, right?
Yeah.
So
But it was interesting. I think I did see like university names attached with that. So that's interesting as well. But,
I think that goes into credential programming, elementary, secondary, special education is there. Do we then, like you're saying, go into separate? I mean, they already said no to that, but that's what's making me think out loud about the separate.
But if they all have, let's just say they all have similar passing rates, like let's say all the different, we find out through numbers, data, that they're all at 50% passing in each of those, then it isn't an issue with the setting or the grade level that they're teaching going into. But then now we have to look at like all the other ones, like ethnicity, which program, you know, we got to look at all of those.
this is the classic problem of correlation versus causation.
Right.
So you can find all sorts of associations, but that doesn't mean one thing caused something else.
Yeah.
And I think we need to unpack as a committee and a group. There have been rightful public concerns about particular groups of teacher candidates who have been held back, kept out, pushed away from the profession. And I've heard at my own local institution many concerns about whether, for example, we are serving BIPOC teacher candidates in a way that would allow them to succeed.
So what's BIPOC?
Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. That's just something that we use at our nomenclature in our college. And so again, the question is, this is an equity question. This is a question of, as people said earlier, making sure that the profession reflects those communities in which we live in and want to have teachers to support and be a part of. So I think it's important to look at that, but I like what you said, that it could be other things too. It could be demographics, it could also be institution, it could be the nature of the subject matter. Are the passing rates the same for math as they are for world language? And what does that mean? What could we learn from that? But I do also wonder if you all are troubled by this sometimes. When we talk about multiple measures, which was always a part of the reform agenda as far as I understood it, there was never one measure. You've said this many times. Why do we have one measure, one instrument? Why don't we have clinical ratings? We do have clinical ratings, right? We rate our candidates with observations. We have grades. We have actual grades in the courses they took in our program for those who were doing more traditional university-based programs. And we have the TPA. How do these things work in concert? So for example, we've had people who had excellent GPAs, excellent teacher observations from the mentor teacher and the university supervisor, but didn't pass the TPA.
Right.
Whose evidence do we trust?
Right.
So I don't know how to put it as a question. How do we
And that
talk about
goes
low rates of passing and what? Low rates of passing the TPA.
sorry, that's the time for 10 minutes. Oh, I was just gonna say, and that goes to the question of validity, because
Right.
if the TPA is a valid measure, then why is it pass, fail?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
Well, I wonder if this goes
are
into
we
this
move
question.
on? Sorry, that was our
Are we-
10-minute timer.
Should we move on? Do we-
Do we need to
We
continue?
are,
So
we
5
are not
minutes?
following
Yeah.
the, so
So we were,
give
I
10
think
minute
we
segments.
did our 10-minute brainstorm.
Okay, so as the
Okay.
timekeeper, are we continuing this conversation for the next 3 minutes, or do you want me to get rid of the timer?
Was that our brainstorm?
I think that was.
Yes, this is great. Got it.
Yeah.
Just do 10-minute increments.
Okay, I'll do another 10 minutes.
Okay,
I'm just
Yeah.
gonna
so
let
should we
the-
just move
Okay.
on? But I feel like we've already did one
Every
and
10
two.
minutes,
I
we'll
know.
reassess what we should.
Bradley,
I have a question. I
sharing this
guess
job
I'm
with
going into questions.
Sure.
And my question to the group with this is in Indy, I just want to understand the difference between clinical and pedagogical support.
Mm.
And then connected to that, similar to what you were saying, is it'd be interesting to understand the connection of the pass rates as connected to clinical and pedagogical support. Like what part of that, what part of the TPA is clinical and what part of it is pedagogical? That would be an interesting question.
And after we brainstorm that related to it, I'm interested in what do we consider sufficient
Mm,
clinical
Mhm.
pedagogical support, like what
Yeah,
needs to be
right.
included, how much.
But because I'm not in the university world, I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
what is the difference between, I know pedagogical, right?
well, I
Pedagogy.
think
and
that's like
clinical.
classroom and real life. For me, it's like what's
Like
we're talking
applied,
about
like
theory.
clinical would be
and
applied,
application.
and then pedagogical would be like the how of
Yeah.
teaching, but then
So
the
we-
clinical would be like applying, you
Yeah.
know, so pedagogy would be happening in the clinical setting, right?
So as a university person, I would think of it as blended, but I would also think of it as foundational coursework that you take in a program to get a credential or a master's.
I see.
Again, that doesn't mean that it's only pedagogical, but it's that. And the clinical is literally being inside of a
Yeah.
classroom,
Yeah.
observing what we call phase 1, others might call phase 2 or 5. 15 hours of teaching, micro teaching,
Mhm.
where the
Mhm.
event takes place.
The
For us,
clinical
typically,
practice
the
is what we
clinical
call it,
practice,
right.
exactly. So I think that's
So
the
for your
same.
program, because it's in the setting,
Yeah.
like it's all
Mhm.
together.
in
Yeah,
It's all one
Yeah,
place.
okay, I
Yeah.
got you.
And then, well,
It-
then I question I guess oh God, what's my word?
It's a good question.
No, for the clinical piece, who's managing the clinical piece and what does it look like? Because I can tell you from having multiple credentials and being at different universities for them, like I had at one year, the first time I got my special ed credential, my clinical instructor, university supervisor physically came out and saw me like 4 to 5 times,
Right.
like, and sat there for a good hour, 2 hours, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And because she was also one of my professors, like the feedback back in the classroom, like it was a great program. And then we go back to equity, because again, I paid a lot of money for that one. But second time when I did it online, it was like, oh, you know, this person's signing off, and it was you got an on-site mentor. Well, my on-site mentor was also a teacher. Like, was she going to get 2 hours? Who was going to give her a
Right.
sub release for 2 hours? And she literally, her and I talked about things, and she signed off on my paperwork. I'm being honest.
Yeah.
And isn't that true with everybody? Because I don't know anyone who was able to get a mentor who got they might have gotten a day off, maybe an hour off, but they did not get 5 days off to sit in a new teacher's classroom and watch them and mentor them through the process. But was that paperwork signed? It absolutely was. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
it's-
like the account,
So
that's
I
the word I'm
think that
looking for,
goes back
accountability
to
piece for the
Sufficient.
clinical.
It is so, it just varies so much across the board what that looks like that dyad, that like triad between the university, the resident teacher, and then the student teacher, it's like, it really does. It really does. And so, and then there are programs or people representing programs in here where there's like an actual co-teaching model where there's like this structure of support, or there's an internship model where it's like it's embedded and you're completely together. And then there's that,
Right.
yeah. So
That goes back
it's
to what you were
wildly
saying
different.
about accountability, and then who is now accountable for the passing rates and the
Right.
clinical practice.
Right. And they all end up with the TPA.
Mhm.
Yeah. In the end.
Right, which brings me back to what is the purpose of the TPA?
Yeah.
Is it going to be what holds programs accountable? You know what I mean?
Right.
Well, that's the thing we heard yesterday, which surprised me, was that we're now possibly looking to study. I haven't read it yet. Got to read a lot here on linking results to program evaluation,
Right.
which was a I'm not good with metaphor. It was a line you didn't want to cross
Right.
15 years ago when you talked about this. You in fact decoupled
Mhm.
this. You did not want institutions being evaluated or programs
Right.
based on the results of their candidates. And now suddenly we're pushing from an equity lens and linking the two.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting question about whether we want, that's what I meant about consequential validity, whether we want this instrument to start essentially through the back door
Yeah.
ranking programs,
Yep.
Right.
which some of us might feel very happy to do, but others might say, whoa, slow down. That's the kind of stuff we don't want to do to our K through 12
Right.
testing regimes. Like,
Yeah.
we don't want that to happen with schools being benchmarked against each other.
But again, then you go into that equity issue, like who can afford to go to these universities and the resources at these universities or programs or whatever else.
Yeah.
And if you're going, you know, I mean, you can see run into a bunch of issues, like universities are going to start only accepting candidates that they know will pass the TPA so that their scores would be inflated. You know what I mean? You run into.
Yeah, don't worry about that because everyone needs tuition these days.
Yeah.
That's one thing I was also asking about. You said about, your concerns about what's the real deal behind a lot of this. I'm wondering too whether everyone needs candidates and everyone needs to become the programs now. So maybe we don't want to have a TPA that gets in the way of selling our program. So I think we need to really guard against that kind of marketing move that's being done through the back door. TPA does set a standard. It does set a universal standard. That may be wrong, but I would argue at least it tries to say equity is also about excellence. And so it's difficult. It's difficult.
In order to be a California teacher.
To be a California teacher. Exactly. So do we go through kind of all these concept areas? Are we pretty good on that?
We want to
Do we want to talk
talk more about what was sufficient. What do you guys consider sufficient support? I know we had different
I think that was our question.
models,
Yeah.
but how much are requiring said someone spent a lot of time with you and then someone just
Right,
kind
well,
of-
that's why I was saying the bullet point should be what is sufficient.
Right,
Like,
it's a
that's our
question.
concern as a
Yeah,
group,
it's
like
a
what is
question.
considered
I
sufficiency
also,
is.
I kind of want to separate, the question as it stands right now is what do we consider sufficient measures of clinical and pedagogical support? But I almost want to separate it in clinical support question
Yes.
and then the next one,
Yeah,
so that we
they are
can really
different.
be clear on what the differences are.
I don't know if we're going to be given a definition or criteria of what is sufficient. It was my understanding that we needed to have,
up with that.
a shared understanding from our different backgrounds that we need to
multiple
give our ideas of
understandings,
what was
yeah.
sufficient
Yeah,
and then develop that.
yeah.
Well, I would say sufficient should be enough to pass the TPA, right?
Teaching
Right?
the test?
Well,
Much.
seriously though, like that would be sufficient, right? If the TPA is the standard, then then the program should be enough to meet it, right? That's whatever that is, like so.
But then I would argue that we're placing too much emphasis on the TPA.
Well, but the TPA
Yeah.
is supposed to be a measure of whatever, you know what I mean? It's the
Yeah.
cat chasing its
Right.
tail, so it's
Yes.
like, so not to teach the test, but if the test is the standard, then, so yeah, it's like defining itself by itself, but,
Yes.
but.
I know, I get exactly
You know
what
what I'm
you're
saying?
saying, yeah.
It's just kind of a joke, but
Right.
yeah.
I think including language like observations and reflection and things like that could be then forcing you to have a sufficient, I don't know, measure of support, including that there should be at least 3 observations per semester, but then who is responsible for that and where does that responsibility lie? But I think part of measuring,
So we're trying to
Sufficient
quantify
support.
the word sufficient, right?
right,
It's,
yeah. I think
in
that's right.
philosophy, the
do.
necessary and sufficient go together. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, go ahead, keep going. I was good. I was
So
straight up.
what I'm trying to work on is, why is it sufficient and not necessary? But we're back to this idea of, what it says here in the actual statute, is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the statute language that we're looking for is necessary,
Yeah.
or sorry, is sufficient.
Sufficient.
And that means enough, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
So then the question might be, who decides?
Yeah.
Based on best practices, good practices models, who decides what is sufficient? And that goes back to the problem of
Mhm.
variation in program.
Yep.
What might be sufficient for a program you described earlier,
Mhm.
and that might not be sufficient for another program.
Mhm.
I wouldn't consider some things you described sufficient for our candidates at
Right.
San Jose State, and I
Right.
would not be happy to provide them with that
Right.
signing off
Mhm.
paperwork. And that kind of talk concerns me so deeply.
Yep.
If I thought our program values reflected that,
Yeah.
they may feel that way,
Right.
Yeah.
but I would want us to project that there's something deeper. So I guess the question is, who decides what's sufficient and what becomes a standard for?
Is that the
Good
university's
practice.
accreditation process? Is
It
that what
could
it
be
is? or-
the qualifier, so I'm jotting down notes, what you're saying, that somehow that is
Sorry,
customized,
that's another 10 minutes. Okay.
is customized for that program of, like, there's this criteria, right, enough to pass, that there, an actual model exists of clinical and pedagogical support. The program has determined a minimum number of observations that is sufficient for their program and their students. So even if it's just kind of the general qualifiers, and then each institution could possibly determine what that number of observations or the model that they're going to use.
I
But
also,
that could be an idea of sufficient, that there are these components that every program should have.
I was just gonna think about our language learners, our adult language learners, and sufficient support could mean observations, but also understanding the translation of the text and how to, I think, one of the implicit biases in the test itself or the TPA itself is that sometimes second or English as a second language may not understand and interpret the same way, and then the responses might be a little bit swayed. So I think sufficient could mean very different things for the place in California that you are and the demographic that you come from as well. So I think that's relevant
Linguistically,
to say.
Can you make it like something like vague, like clearly defined and approved by blank, like
Mhm.
just like the entity of whatever that blank is, like can you do that? Is that you're the one, it's like, do you have to quantify it? Can you just say like, can you say something more like that? Like,
I'll look at my norms again, if I can answer that question. You mean, can we all?
no, I mean, like
Just
when you're
quantify
looking
it.
at, when
It's
you're looking at ed
sufficient,
code and you're
yeah.
like, okay, you say offer sufficient clinical
Mhm.
pedagogical support. Can then an institution then say something like, okay, sufficient then means like at our institution that it's going to be like sufficient needs to be, we can say that sufficient needs to be clearly defined and and approved, by the institution or the program, so that like we don't have to say what it is. It's just they have to say what it is and they have to get approved by the CTC.
Are we at recommendations already?
No, I'm just wondering if that is if functionally that can happen, like if that is a move that can be made,
Well, I think that's
Yeah.
I think that's relevant to the implementation, though.
Yeah.
If that's not a thing, then
Yeah.
would it be a thing? Could we
Yeah,
say to the
so that's my question.
institutions?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's a question mark question.
It's a question.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a suggestion, it's a question mark.
And
question.
sufficiency has to be related to resources, because you can only do the things
Say
you're
the
capable of.
question
Not,
one more time so I can-
sufficiency requires attention to resources. Oh, sorry, I apologize.
I'm just kind of trying to figure out the context thing, like how do you fool with that, Like how do you, I don't even know what the question was anymore. It was like,
You know?
it was
My
like,
brain got
okay,
lost.
so like when you're talking about, okay, if the sufficient clinical and pedagogical support, can you define that by
Can we-
program, by having them
Can programs define?
clearly define
Clearly
that and
define.
have it approved,
Clearly define
know,
their
like,
measurements.
Yeah, clearly
their
articulate and like define their measurements and have it approved by.
measurements of sufficient support.
Yeah.
What is the entity that gives, that does the accreditation?
CTC.
It is CTC.
Yeah.
Okay, so then it would be by the CTC.
Yeah, I mean, they'd have to have their definition ironed out, I suppose. That's the thing, but it's not our
But then
business.
could we say the TPAs require that a TPA, whatever
Mhm.
institution, requires that you have a number of observations, a number of inquiry-based reflection meetings or something,
Mhm.
and I don't know, something else.
Mhm,
And
they
then
could.
say to the institutions, how will you be embedding this within your coursework? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be like some flexibility within to accommodate like the vast differences, And so I just don't understand how the CTC can possibly accommodate those differences. I don't know. It's just kind of mind-boggling,
Yeah.
So sorry,
I don't know how to do
I
it.
feel like we're really diving down very
Too far.
specifically. Yeah,
Mhm.
and I still
Okay.
need to be at focus concepts. And I
Okay.
got the charge from Adam today that we were supposed to really keep talking
Mhm.
today
Okay.
to each other,
Okay.
which we are doing a lot,
I was
really
gonna say, are
well.
we talking?
We're
We're
doing
talking
great.
about-
So I want to say we're doing great, but I
Should we
just do
move
feel like
on?
I'm still not, I want to go back to sufficiency, what Jason, I think, was sort of bringing up, which was how would we agree on what sufficiency means as a
Mhm.
group? Um,
Do we need to agree on it?
Or just how would we
Yeah,
surface more?
discuss,
You
yeah.
think we're done with it?
Well, I just
I
think
just think
that,
we don't have to. That's
Okay,
the
so
Yeah, I
we've
guess-
written some questions down.
yeah, well, that's why I was saying in the bullet point would be like, we are, as a group, concerned with the definition of-
Right.
of sufficiency.
I
and
think
we-
that's the thing. It's like, it's like being concerned with it. It's like, that is my answer to that question. I
Yes,
guess.
thank you.
Personally,
Sorry, I was
that's my
just-
personal answer to that question.
Well,
I was
and-
going, said shared understanding, and I was just going off of the recommended or suggested timeline, the brainstorm possible attributes, which is we would hear the word sufficient, and then we would say what we think from our different backgrounds that we think is sufficient, and then see if there are any themes or common elements that would be like a shared understanding, not necessarily full
Okay.
agreement.
Right, I see. So do you want to just bullet point our idea ideas of sufficient as a group. So sufficient, what your definition or your idea was that enough to pass. Yeah, enough to pass the I'm sorry. The
I was kind of
TPAs.
kidding. I was kind of kidding.
No, but I think that is,
It's a brainstorm.
it's a
Okay.
brainstorm. And I think that's what you said is valid though, because it can't be, like, maybe that is what
I take it back. I
sufficient
take it
is.
back.
No, I'm not
I
saying, I'm
take it
not
back
putting your
because-
name on
yeah,
it,
because
but
what I really think is like, I think that's a really, like, it's gonna be, it's a subjective thing, like sufficient, like, I'm gonna have a hard time nailing that one down, you know, I really am, so.
My question in this whole thing, I'm gonna connect point B and D together and say sufficient, and then they're gonna assist programs to support candidates to pass the thing, so
I'm sorry, what are you looking at for, there's so many B's and D's, okay, sorry.
So here, right, in B, we ensure programs
Wrong page.
offer
Sorry.
sufficient clinical and pedagogical support to the candidates to pass the assessments. And if they don't pass, right, D is they shall assist the programs to use evidence-based strategies to support candidates to pass the assessment. So what is the connection between sufficiency and assistance is my
Right,
question.
yeah.
What does that
Good
look like
question.
in practical real life, getting out of theory? I wonder, and also the who of that, right? What does assistance look like in order to be sufficient in clinical and pedagogical support?
So what I what I have down is that there a actual support model exists. I said earlier, someone mentioned that there's a minimum number of observations. That sufficient also means that that sufficiency level is clearly defined by the institution. There's sufficiency pays attention to resources that are available. The sufficient support should be evidence-based assistance. Sufficient is that there is support for cultural, linguistic, and abled candidates, and then differently abled candidates. And then sufficiency also makes room for context.
Thank you.
Kiss your brain.
I know.
Can you read?
Sources there too, maybe read that
No,
again.
could you just repeat from the top? Sorry, I only got the last three.
Oh, the top,
Yeah.
that there's a
Minimum number of observations.
yeah, support model exists. Minimum number of observations. The institution clearly defines sufficiency for their context. Sufficiency pays attention to the resources of the institution or takes that into account. Sufficiency is evidence-based assistance. You had the cultural, linguistic. When I say differently abled, I just think about candidates
Yeah,
who do
I
that.
absolutely
Okay.
agree with you. Yep, it should be it should be universal. Designed and accessible.
Good job there.
Thanks. Let's try my best. This is all misspelled.
So.
Okay. Thank you.
That's
for that.
Do we have to get to focus area 4 and 5
No.
today?
No, just.
So do we want to talk about any
Yeah,
other
sure.
resources or information that we
No.
want?
Oh, that's our other 10 minutes, sorry. We're at 11:34.
And we
And
need
do we go to 12 or what
We
time
need
do we
to
go to?
finish by
11:50.
11:50.
50, okay, so another
Yeah.
10 minutes, here we go.
We're doing good.
So I think the first piece of information that we need is what is communicated to the IHEs regarding sufficient levels of support.
Great.
What did I say?
What is
What is communicated to the
What is
IHEs
communicated, thank
regarding
you.
sufficient
What
levels
does
of support?
IHE stand for?
Institution of higher
Higher
education. Not to be confused with IHG.
Yeah,
It's
so
just-
I was
like,
thinking
why
of
am
my.
talking about the report?
I thought it was just me.
Sorry. Sorry.
IHGs were like the IHGs.
Sorry.
I was the
I
only
wouldn't
one
wish
who's
that
thinking
upon
out loud.
either.
Are we going to the holiday?
Yeah, love those acronyms. What was the other piece of, the other thing that we needed was I think the differences, or the similarities between the TPAs.
Yeah.
To be able to understand what does evidence-based mean.
Right.
And also, what are the various components of different
Across different TPAs.
For focus area 3 is, I feel like focus area 1 seems like, oh, we're talking to the assessment designers. And the focus area 2 seems like we're talking to the programs, recommendations for our programs. And focus area 3 recommendations to strengthen the accreditation system. So this is talking to the commission.
Could you clarify the first one again? You thought was about the designers? Which one?
It says, focus area 1 says modifications to the current assessments.
I'm trying to read that word.
On the first page, focus area 1.
Under focus area 3? Oh,
Because I'm trying to get the audience for each focus
Yeah.
area.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the recommendations ultimately for focus area 3 that's for the commission. It says strengthen the accreditation system,
So we're
and they
saying,
have to ensure programs are embedding this support.
is there anything that the commission currently does with these IHEs to show that they are doing to ensure?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good.
Say it again. This is my challenge of
Like, what
taking
is,
as an
the commission currently doing
But
to
it's the
ensure
communication.
programs are offering sufficient support? I mean, there's also the embedding. The second one is the new one, correct? That they
Correct,
are
that
going
it
to
will-
actual support
if
for
it's
low
passed.
pass rates.
And I guess similarly to that, how would then the commission know what types of assistance each of these programs would need?
What does that look like?
And what would that look like?
So a lot of
account for the context in each area, I guess, in California or states, universities, different states.
are there bodies to do this work?
Bodies and people,
Yeah,
like in the CTC?
yeah.
Okay.
CT.
Yeah,
So
so we just expanded the
I've
job
always wanted
description.
someone to swoop in and tell my district what to do, but
Yeah.
I'm like, you guys don't have people to come down here and see what's going on. And,
Like the
make
Learning
these changes.
Policy Institute or so. There's other people who will do that work. You just like,
for all of California.
And so our recommendation is you double your department CTC because there's a huge accountability piece. that
There's
we
so
are-
many universities and
Right.
programs. It's not like
Yeah.
3 major universities on.
What is
I've
it?
been part of the team for when the district intern program in LAUSD went through the accreditation process. It was, I think, 2 or 3 days of someone from the CTC coming to talk to us to go through. But again, that's 3 days that, and the same thing with when I was at the high school and we went through accreditation. Again, it's someone came for a whole week.
Yeah.
So, and we put our, you know how it is, you put your best foot forward
Yeah.
and there were a lot of things I want to smile and say we did like a week, 2 weeks before knowing that the CTC was going to come.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? And then you kind of question and wonder, like, do they see the horse and pony or is it dog and pony
Dog
show
and
that's put on for those 3 days for the accreditation piece?
We have about 10 minutes left before, do we want to, as a group, kind of want to do what Vanessa started and kind of think about what we may be able to share out about each focus point. I really
Sure.
like I appreciate it again, Jason,
Yeah.
the focus back to the audience of each of these. And
Yeah.
it might be helpful to summarize ideas under each of our focus
Yeah.
places around what maybe
Mhm.
what we want to
In each
share out
area,
about each
yeah.
of those things.
And I can kind of read off what we have as notes for the first part. Focus area 1, valid and authentic work of teach. Should I just read off what we said, and then we can then come up with some questions? Okay. Is it personalized to reflect teacher context? Is it authentic? Where are we going back to standards? What is it used for? And is it ideal versus practical, or reality versus practicality? We have concerns about definition of formative, how formative is the videos in teacher preparation programs. Formative should be ongoing, constructive, low stakes, reasonable implementation into a wide range of classroom settings. And then we should probably give more context on classroom settings. And then is the TPA flexible enough to capture the different context and settings for different teachers? Shifting language to credential candidates versus beginning teachers. Developmentally sensitive, flexible enough to describe inclusive, appropriate versus relative versus development. And then how do we embed the TPAs into coursework? How is this communicated across the different institutions?
So the word appropriate, it wasn't that we were necessarily suggesting that it was one or the other. It was like, it was a question mark, and then we threw out like all the things that it could be.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were like, this is not clear. And then we were like, it could be this, or this, depending on your angle, you know? So we were just like, this was just sitting here waiting to be interpreted. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
So for this focus area 1, are there relevant questions and resources needed to continue with our conversation, or to add anything here?
I think, yeah, wow, just hearing all that summarized back out, I'm
I
like,
know.
wow.
I know, go team.
We're really
Yeah.
smart.
I did a lot of discussion here.
So funny.
Super smart people in here. Yeah, I really appreciate the summary of that. And I think the essence to that I think that we spent the most amount of time in was again like clarifying some of those definitions. But we didn't. I mean, that was just again a high level bar, not really trying to drill down into that. But yeah, I think we talked a lot about like context. For that,
We talked a lot about context, about sufficient. Those were,
But is there
For focus
anything
area
that
1,
we
yeah.
could then say is a resource or information?
On the evidence-based, I'd love to know about where the evidence-based resources are.
Yeah.
Is it a manual? Is it a handbook? Is it a compendium? Is it a go-to website? Is it already in the TPA itself?
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
glossary
we're talking about-
definitions, and
yeah.
so what are the?
And
Where the
I
resources?
also like relevant to candidates, IHE, university supervisors, different people across different
Is it customizable?
stakeholders, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
For all stakeholders. Where are the evidence-based resources located for all stakeholders?
Yeah, I like
Right?
I like the concept of being able to
sorry.
focus on the.
that is
I think we had a lot of questions around
1144.
who the stakeholders are too.
Who are the
You have the
stakeholders,
question.
yeah.
You have the question of what is the what is the TPA? Excuse me. What is the TPA purpose? Right, that
Right.
can change depending, or not change, but like the question of like how is that interpreted by all the different stakeholders, and is it? Are we are we trying to calibrate that, or is it okay for
Mhm.
different stakeholders to have different ideas about what the purpose is?
Right, because yesterday when we were talking, there was like, this was the original intention, the Darling Hammond and all that, but it's like, is that, going forward, is that how we're conceiving of this? And practically, is that how we're using this? And
So for focus area 1, we have as our questions down. Nope, that's 3. Nope. What are the evidence-based resources for all stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders? How is success defined for each stakeholder? I'm just going to read down the list of what I have that way, and then we can go back. What is communicated to the IHEs regarding the sufficient levels of support and implementation? What does evidence-based mean across the different TPAs? What is the commission currently doing to for IHEs to ensure support? What does the systems of programs look like that relate to the context of the classroom? And who's responsible for the accountability of the sufficient support measures at the IHE and the CTC? And then we also, should we include what we talked about in terms of definition of sufficient to the whole group? Or, right,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, well, if we're going by focus areas, I mean,
sorry, that what I just read off was all of
focus
the
area.
ending. Yeah,
okay,
so maybe if
all
there's
of it.
yeah.
Nice.
So if we want to go back to focus area 2, and then is there anything else that we want to ask to the whole group? Or present to the whole group, right? Is that what we're?
Yeah, what is
Yeah.
embedded?
Okay.
I mean, that's where the variation takes off, because it's like, some people say, yeah, it's very embedded. People say, no. So what do we know about embeddedness?
yeah,
In exemplary
Yes.
programs, or programs that we would want to know more about or just learn something?
did
What
we,
are they embedding?
And then even just what you just said, like, what is an exemplary program?
Yes,
Mhm.
no question about that.
Yeah.
We'll know after they rate everybody. Just kidding.
And I did space out for a second. Did we talk about who passes and disaggregating that?
No, we
and all
should
that?
definitely do that. I
Okay.
was trying to look for the other.
That's feasible and fair and
yeah.
like equity across programs and outcomes and all that.
Sorry, what is this additional support? Is this the same type of support for all candidates? What does the additional support look like? How is it calibrated across universities? What does the passing rate mean? What are the pass rates across EdTPA, CalTPA, FAST? What are the accountability measurements? Who's responsible for the passing rates? Institutional, individual, commission. What are we looking at in terms of passing rates? Language learners, backgrounds, educational levels. Which candidates are passing in terms of levels, elementary, secondary, or special education? What research is relevant to the development and recruitment in BIPOC teachers and diversification of the workforce? And what measurements of success what are the measurements of success? Course grades, TPA, clinical practice observations, and what are the clinical and pedagogical supports that are embedded?
Nice.
2 more connections to pass rates. Oh no, I lost my train of thought there. What do we consider sufficient measures of clinical support and sufficient measures of pedagogical support?
I hate to do this at the last minute, but
Do
I
it.
think we need to put as a placeholder, focus area concepts. We were given A, B, C, D, and then we added evidence-based. What I think we've been skirting around, which is really fascinating to me, is generalizability or rater reliability or rater scoring or rater anything. In other words, this is one of the biggest concerns that I've heard
Rating.
people raise. So rating. So we might say, since it's, I don't know if it's in the statute, I don't think it's even in there, which really surprised me. Maybe, so let's look for it. So what do we make sense of score consistency? Who's scoring? How consistent are they? This is something that Pearson could provide us with insights into, so they could give us some insight into how they're
I have a
moderating.
colleague that is a grader.
Yeah, great.
So they apply for the position. It It pays a whooping, I think $19 an hour. And then if you get some kind of whatever, you might go up to 22. But they do calibrations. So you go through a rigorous training process and then you do calibrations, and it's not until you consistently score at the level that and consistent of other scores or what it should be that you become
Yes.
a scorer. Huh?
Pearson. They're the ones who
Yeah.
are running the radar
How
reliability.
is Pearson monitoring calibration?
Right.
So again, but they use a set of
Sorry.
rubrics, so it's their concept of what.
Yep.
Yeah.
And again,
Right.
if it's their concept, then who are the Pearson? Are they former
that.
teachers? Are they
Well,
current
what
or
I want
former?
to set this for Cal TPA design, can we demand that it be California? I don't know if I said TPA have California teachers on it, so I want to know which states are the Raiders living in. And that's another issue. I guess we start it and say we're ready to go.
Definitely.
Yes.
Go ahead. Well, what are we discussing now? Just what we're going to present for the whole group?
Yes.
We have 30 minutes to.
We were on time. We were doing great.
Good job.
Okay, so
Yeah.
did we want to kind of just, are we divvying it up, or do we have one speaker?
Good question.
So let's decide on that. Well, first of all, who's interested in speaking and presenting our group's information?
Not it.
Okay, I was gonna say not it too.
We
So
can
then,
all- yeah, we
okay,
can
so
all-
then let's divvy it up since we don't have one
Okay.
person who's overzealous about it. Okay. Honestly, I'm voting for you, Jason, just because you did a great job on just one part, the sufficiency part, like you
I
had it
know,
nicely
you
written
had that
with a
moment where
diagram.
it's like,
So can we,
Well, I feel,
how do you feel?
I'm fine with the portions where we have to talk about, where's the possible attributes and then what we thought. So I was taking notes on that. I just needed clarification on certain things. And then I think you did a good job of presenting the questions, because I think those are laid out.
Yes, the questions about what, sorry, I'm writing notes.
Well, we had a list of questions.
Oh, questions and concerns, sorry, over.
Questions,
Mainly about terminology and definition, wasn't it? No?
well,
Concern, just,
So just, yeah,
that's fine,
listed
questions,
in the-
concerns. And then, Brian, you had a lot of passions. Was there a section that you feel like you want to speak to? Because I thought you were very articulate
No,
about it.
I absolutely want to decenter myself, so.
Okay, decenter it is. Alicia, Al?
I don't know. I feel like I talk too much too.
Only 5 minutes, so
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so just the two of you?
I'm fine getting
Sure.
I just need to make sure that I have everything for that attributes. So you can help me out with anything that's missing. So
Mhm.
for focus area number 1,
Okay. Go ahead.
the attributes that we talked about for valid and authentic were personalized to and reflects teacher's context. It's actual and real, so reflect actual classroom skills. It's meaningful, again, contextualized, applicable and practical. And then towards the end, Brent, you mentioned something about scoring consistency. So for something to be valid, like, right,
And
what is the scoring process and not neglecting the raters?
And we also wrote something about, or raised concerns about it, valid for the use of what?
Yeah, I think that was where I was going with my comment.
Yeah.
Because the other one is actually technically under reliability, but we're just not using the R word, the nasty R word. So I think that should be separate as like a F or G or whatever. That scoring thing should not necessarily be bled straight into the valid. I think we can start with valid and just play with that problem. Then I think valid for whose use. Whose use, because the big idea too is decision makers, right? Who's making a decision to warrant that you can join a classroom? So just for whose use.
And then we also had something about it being standard, that we have standards themselves that right. What was,
Yeah,
sorry, I have it bullet pointed, so I'm like, what was it?
Performative, I had ongoing constructive growth, low stakes. You can give feedback and have opportunities to revise.
Can I add a
Yeah.
couple more attributes in there now that I can nerd out on it? Is it okay? We add a few more, or are we
Yeah.
not iterating?
Yeah.
I would add timely, right? That's the key, timely. Just add that to what we got.
Timely.
And I would also add actionable. The formative is actionable thing. You can do something with the information to improve. That's like revise. That's another way of saying you could revise. You have the
Yeah.
opportunity to revise, rethink, redo.
Right.
So just actionable, timely, and the rest of it's good.
Right. And then also under that, we had talked about just the nature of the TPAs, that our concern is it's summative because there is no opportunity to get feedback and resubmit.
Mhm.
And then we also talked about being formative in the teacher prep program.
Mhm. And I remember yesterday, they do this a lot when they talk about TPA. They say educative. Because in that sense, they can scoot the formative problem. But the formative thing we were talking about, and students really feel this, candidates feel this, how much advice and coaching can I get from you on my TPA? And we had strict protocols laid out.
Well,
So
they're not supposed to, right?
Which then brings us back to how formative can something be?
Without reflection.
Anyways, that's.
Yeah.
She shared the questions.
What?
Can you write that?
No.
Well, you don't have to, yeah.
Well, let's
We're
see.
good. We're
Can
just
you
going
go
through.
through the
So-
questions that will pose?
Oh, some of our questions.
Or,
Um,
sorry, let's continue with
Yeah, let's
attributes
just
before we get
continue
into
with the
Were
attributes.
reasonable. Wrong spot here.
to implement in a wide range of classroom settings. We had concerns about the definition of classroom setting. What is the setting? What is the context? And bottom line is the TPA flexible enough to capture the different contexts or settings?
So, real quick, are we going through the attributes of only just focus for area one, or are we gonna?
I thought it was-
take the
It's
whole
all
listing?
three. I'm
All
just-
three, okay.
My part is I'm talking about kind of our shared understanding of the terms from our conversation, our areas of expertise.
Okay.
And then Vanessa is sharing the questions that we have.
Great.
Yep.
So just be mindful if Linda is reading off the questions, I'm not jotting that down. I'm just assuming that you are going to talk about those questions.
And then there's the third piece in this, which is identify sources that you would like
Yes. that's another
to support deliberation. So is that gonna be listed, under questions?
I think so,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
we can talk about that, yeah.
But for the reasonable for classroom settings, I wasn't sure, the conversation that we were talking about is developmentally sensitive, that is relevant, standards-based, considering things like language learners. Was that for the
I put
reasonable portion or the appropriate?
I put it under appropriate
Yes.
because I wasn't sure if we had moved on to appropriate, but it sounded appropriate.
So yeah, I think that's under appropriate. And that was the real question of what is a beginner versus what is a developmentally sensitive approach.
Right.
But is this for, so that is it saying the assessment itself is appropriate for that early level in the teaching profession?
And I used the word teacher learning progressions. I want to slip that back in again because I think there's another way to talk about development and progress called learning progressions. And we don't often think that teachers have their own trajectories, their own learning. They do. We don't even know much about them.
Well, that's
Isn't
what I
that what the
meant by
TPA
development.
That's
what
exactly.
what
So I just saying,
meant.
so we
Yeah.
add that to as well, learning
Yeah.
progressions, teacher learning progressions.
Is that not the TPEs?
No,
No.
they're not teacher learning
No.
progressions. They're
They're
standards.
Progressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're
They're-
not even like really
Right.
looking at what a teacher can do at this moment,
Mhm.
at this part of practice. They're very general documents. A teacher-centered approach, I think, would be more looking at proximally. It's like ZPD from Vygotsky, like for a
They're like
teacher.
human development
Human development. How can they grow into this
as a teacher,
practice?
like a teacher, becoming a teacher,
So,
Whereas the word beginning just skirts all that.
right, which then
Mhm.
differentiates between credential candidate and beginning teacher.
And seasoned teachers and
Yeah.
veteran teachers.
You could even do
Novice.
expert novice,
Yeah,
yeah,
that-
like that, but then you
mhm.
fill in between the
Mhm.
expert novice stuff.
Right, it's a learning process, like
Yeah.
how much can you, like there's shades of gray, and like how do you scaffold from one piece to the next, and like, acknowledging that that's a process and.
Right, and what do we know about it, or not?
Similar to like putting things on a rubric, right?
Mhm.
Like,
That's
in
the
sections
shortcut as
go,
well,
we got-
yeah.
We have the core instructional rubric, which says here you are at
Yeah.
beginning, expert or whatever. And teachers kind of make goals around
Yeah.
how to move along that continuum. I think that's similar to also the standards. I don't know if they're changing, but yeah. So
Well,
that
the
would be
TPAs
something-
have rubrics, and the rubrics
okay.
use the language of developing, I mean, you're using all the language,
Uh-huh.
but are they actually developmentally
Like a
I
developmental
see.
model,
appropriate?
Mhm.
They've kind of scooted that question,
They
because,
have.
sausage gets made differently when you're trying to think about what a teachers need versus what do we need to set a standard for.
Mhm.
So were there any shared understandings for the reasonable?
Yeah, we didn't put that in.
Okay.
I don't think we did, right?
For
Evidence
reasonable, no,
based.
well, we did talk about like appropriate, reasonable, like what we talked about evidence, like what's the evidence?
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
But that could cut across everything too.
mhm.
We did not problematize, according to my memory, right now it's a little bit late in the afternoon or early, reasonable. We just kind of let that one go.
Yeah, because we got hung up on context.
Yeah.
And so reasonable is attached to context.
Maybe we could just ask
Right,
for
I guess
guidance
that's what
on,
it is.
or we're supposed to say what we think the attributes are versus ask for guidance on
Just
what do we
the
mean by
key-
reasonable.
Yeah, the key, and I can,
Well, didn't that also kind of just fall under also what's sufficient, like
Yes,
reasonable,
reasonable,
sufficient?
appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
Not
For-
duplicative.
The E
and
was
then,
evidence
just
based.
mentioned that we added evidence based.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. Focus
That's
area.
what we need for the,
Oh,
any questions? for-
can I go back to what
Yeah,
we?
here, you wanna
we
take a look?
had? Yeah. Yes.
Rather
That's
than me
relevant.
reading it
Uh-oh. Is it? Oh, no, you closed it.
Sorry,
That's
here.
So do you want to stay on focus area 1 or jump over to the focus concepts in area 2 as well? Are you going to present those as well, or?
Is that it? for
I was
today?
giving Vanessa
Basically.
time
Well,
to, if
to-
we
Here you
want,
To ask questions
her to have
regarding.
questions.
One.
Focus
Two
area one.
focus area.
Sorry, dear.
It's 2%.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so the questions that we want to make sure that we're posing is,
And if they're listed, because I know you read off the notes already.
I did, but I'm having a hard time. connecting. Oh. Two.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have a question in there around, oh, you're about to read them, okay.
How do we ensure that we have similar parts in TPA versus portfolio? Appropriate and reasonable, what's the evidence based, or what is the evidence for appropriate and reasonable, embed and not a test? How is this communicated to the different institutes to implement? Yeah, so that's what we kind of summarized last time.
Can we also throw in that, I mean, I think I also remember bringing up kind of a question of like time and embedded, I think time and embeddedness, right, around like, so I just learned that, was it Fresno has it like chunked out versus,
Cal TPA
Oh,
does
Cal
for sure. I don't know
TPA,
anything
right.
about FAST. I'm very ignorant about that. I'd like to
Yeah.
know
Oh,
more.
okay, so what,
but like the, with reasonableness, how are we talking about time? Because I feel like that would be a question. If I were gonna take the TPA right now, and that from what I hear from teacher candidates, time, how's my time being used? Time is a very valuable resource, right? Is it being used effectively in this TPA, or what does that look like in terms of reasonableness for teacher candidate and them having to study and teach and lesson plan and do all that jazz at the same time?
We did have a question similar to. What is reasonable to ask of a credential candidate?
Yeah.
Between coursework, clinical practice, and assessment prep.
I almost want to ask us, do we know what they think is reasonable? Like, have we asked the users around that?
And what do you mean by reasonable in terms of like, what do you mean? And I asked that only because like it just dips its toe into like all kinds of things. Like, no, it dips its toe into like all kinds of discussions, like the whole thing of like who gets to do credential programs and how like, you know, just the traditional credential programs themselves are gatekeepers. And so like, why do we have a teaching course that looks the way it does? Because you have to like, if you do a traditional credential program, like you have to quit working for a year and pay to do, you know what I mean? So it's like the idea of reasonable is like loaded to the gills, you know?
Right.
In
And if someone
itself.
is going into an accelerated program, you
Right.
can't complain it's unreasonable because it was a choice that you made to
It's-
accelerate
it's,
yourself.
It's already in its nature unreasonable.
Right.
Right. So it's like, you know, internship programs are reasonable, you know, so anyway, so it's like, you know, the most like balanced university program is already unreasonable by my standards, you know, so,
I feel like we always go back to the credentialing programs themselves, because if we're looking at like TPAs and passing rates and stuff, like, then I want to ask the question, like, are people in accelerated programs passing the TPAs?
Yep.
right.
And if they're not, should there be an accelerated program? Like the teachers that are coming out of these accelerated programs, if they're not passing TPAs and they're not getting reelected, you know what I mean? Then they're obviously
yeah,
not
I think
prepping
that brings
teachers
us back
properly.
to
You know what I
what
mean?
data do we
We
have
right.
that shows passing scores between
Between
LTPA?
Yeah, and I
between
think
programs.
I agree with you on that. It's like,
Yeah.
have we asked the users, the teachers themselves around what they would believe is to be reasonable in the context of their own lives?
Yeah.
And is there flexibility for different
Right.
models for that? And you would need, you know, the passing rates of all these different types of things, but that we has there been questions around surveying, you know, teachers of different places in their lives?
Okay, so
I was gonna say, do you need more for the
no, let's move on to
number one?
Okay,
Number two.
so number two. Okay,
Yeah.
so focus recommendations for us. So we talked about, again, I'm just reading off bullet points so you guys condensed this. We talked about modifications and revisions, right? So that we're looking at how the TPA is summative, but the process of passing can be formative depending on the teacher prep program. We talked about how candidates feel stressed, saying they shouldn't have to take the TPAs and it was a waste of time. So there's that need to embed better so it doesn't feel irrelevant. And then we talked about if TPAs could be broken up into chunks or scaffolds added. So instead of one big test portfolio, whatever you want to call it, that it's in pieces, you can pass section 1, section 2, section 3. And then overall, we just want to know more about the different assessments. So we want to know what the Cal TPA looks like, what the Ed TPA looks like, and what the FAST looks like. Just that's our big question. Like, what do those assessments, or lack of a better word, look like?
Yeah.
Are they comparable to each other? What are their passing rates for each other?
So my questions is, what are the connections between support and passing scores in Cal TPA, Ed TPA, and FAST? Is that right?
And then we did ask, along with that same line of thought, we did ask is there, is there evidence that because the Cal TPA is broken up into two pieces versus the Ed TPA, which is one piece, is there a higher passing rate with the Cal TPAs since it's broken down?
Yeah.
And then is it more authentic if we could break it down and make it more manageable? And then we made a comment about how we, if we teach with UDL, then why are we not assessing teachers in the same way?
Could you read, I think there was a question that talked about different learners, different labels. Maybe that's for candidates or for focus area 3.
This for 3.
Well, we did say something about duplicative work too. Sorry.
That's later
I
on.
wanted to add in there UDL and also multilingual learners, because I think you also are bringing in like.
It was an example of like modeling.
Yes.
Basically, we should be modeling what it's like. It's like
Practice what we preach.
Exactly. We
concept
should
was
be, you know, like that, like telling them how to do the thing.
I think that was,
You
it
know?
might have been in,
Yeah.
it might have been in 3, but I think I remember, I'm just linking those two together because I'm thinking like UDL and, you know, all the concerns around, you know, supporting multilingual learners in understanding passing, prepping or whatever, and just also modeling those strategies.
Inclusive practice, all the things, you know, all the things.
So if I'm looking at embedding assessments in coursework and clinical work and kind of looking back at the questions we talked about before.
I don't remember what section it was in, but I just felt like it was a.
Oh, what
a
do we
good-
know about the embedding of the TPAs and what
Right.
is an exemplar
We really have to
program?
ask that.
What do we mean by support and are they universally supported? Right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're relating to or no?
I-
Just
Might
the
be a
first
different
part?
topic than what you were alluding to. We got to
What
have
do
that
we
in
know
there.
about? Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been struck by in our conversations is, again, our different experiences. Do we even take the same courses in credential programs? Are they labeled similarly? Are they fused in interdisciplinary frames? I see this in our own program all the time. Like, we have a course called, in our case, assessment. Most CSUs don't have an assessment course.
And
So
with my
it's-
residents, our elementary and secondary teachers are taking completely different courses and
Exactly.
are not overlapping at all.
Exactly.
And so they're getting to,
Yeah. So
It's pretty horrible. I've had to try to transfer course
credits, yeah.
credits, and
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
and writing an argument about it, and it came down to, well, yours is a semester course, ours is quarter, so we can't take it. I'm like, my semester should count more, so why wouldn't you be able to?
was there anything else about focus area 2 in the like later questions
yeah,
or
so we
anything
had-
else that
actually
we
we
want to
had a-
make sure that we
hold on.
pose to everyone?
Hold on,
So we have the duplicative question.
Yeah, there was something about.
yes, okay, so that was part of it. So we talked a lot about how God, okay, so students are saying they're doing the same thing over and over again, right? The same type of work, same like grading lesson plans, but our other side of it is we're looking at things from a different lens. So it might feel duplicative, but it really isn't. But do the candidates understand that?
So I
Yeah.
guess that's what the universal design of embedding the TPAs. Right? Or no?
I think
Sorry, am I
I think
misinterpreting?
that your question was how explicit is that made in the credential programming around the different perspectives, right? That you
Yes.
could be
Right.
you could be doing lesson planning from one perspective, but you have this other place, but the candidates may feel that's duplicative because they're not really that explicit around
Right.
the different lenses that we're
Yes.
talking about, or the
Right.
different
And
reflections.
as novices, it would make sense because they're not differentiating and
Right.
schematizing
Right,
these
right,
separate things like
right.
experts do. So we're
Right.
thinking about that way all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
They see it as
exactly.
just blurred.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and then we also talked about how we're looking at duplicative, but like credentialing program versus induction,
Mhm.
and what, and our, even just our expectations like of a credentialed candidate versus a beginning teacher.
So
Mhm.
maybe does that go back into how the CTC is communicating with the
Could be.
IHEs regarding coursework and clinical work.
Isn't that more on the is that a fact finding? Do we want to know more about how they're doing that? Is that
Right,
one
that's
thing?
what
So
I'm thinking.
rather than recommendations, like this, do we want to know how they do it? What's the communication on?
Right,
embedding
yeah,
this?
what do they already do?
Right, exactly.
And what is the discrepancy between?
Okay, which leads us to like our most important question is what is the purpose or goal of the TPA?
That's the meta.
Yeah.
That's a big one because that determines a lot of this whole duplicative, like,
Exactly.
and some of our other questions as well. So that's just
So
gonna
what
highlight
is
that
the
one.
purpose and towards stakeholders?
Yes, and making it. But we did have a thing on multiple measures, which I think we
Yeah,
should
that's
throw
what I
out again, because that's the